Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Today we venture deep into the heart of Texas, where forgotten ghost towns hide deadly secrets in their crumbling buildings and silent streets. From eerie lights haunting dark rivers to ancient forces that never should have been disturbed, these 20 Texas ghost towns are more than abandoned. They're cursed. Stay with us. If you dare before we begin, most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing and miss the creepiest, spine-tingling tales only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit subscribe now. Tonight's just the beginning, and the terror waiting in the darkness is far from over. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there as we dive into the darkness. I drove into Bonham's End just as the sun bled out behind the low, ragged hills, dirt kicking up in clouds behind my tires, the air tasting dusty and stale. The road was little more than two tired ruts carved through scrub and mesquite, and halfway there the engine started to cough, as though warning me what lay ahead. When I finally rounded the last bend, the town huddled against a steely gray sky looked like a set piece in a nightmare. Dilapidated clapboard houses with doors yawning open, a church steeple leaning like a drunk, and beyond it, the cemetery. Cluster of broken headstones and rusted iron fencing that looked more like a cage than a place of rest. I felt something twist in my gut as I parked on the cracked earth and stepped out, the solace of my boots crunching over shattered glass and bone-dry leaves. At first light I walked among the graves, toes dragging through sunken earth. Names had worn away. Dates were indecipherable, except for a cluster of small markers lined against a low stone wall at the back, each dated 1887. Their epitaph spoke of innocence, a child here, a mother there claimed by cholera in a single summer. Legend said the town's gravediggers, overwhelmed by death, buried dozens in a panic, stacking coffins 3 deep in hurried shafts. The living left in terror and the town emptied almost overnight. But the bodies, rumor claimed, weren't laid to rest. Something woke in those putrid graves, and at night the dead tried to claw their way out. That night I camped at the edge of the cemetery, lanterns swinging from a fence post. A hot wind rattled through the wires and the lanterns' glow danced across the headstones in fractured patterns. I thought I heard just once a faint scrape, as though nails were raking across stone. I lifted my lamp, heart threatening to shatter my ribs, but saw only darkness crouching behind cracked monuments. I told myself it was the wind, a branch brushing an old marker. Still, I positioned the truck so the headlights could prick the grove of stunted oaks, and I slept with the ignition running. At midnight I woke to the lantern guttering. The wind had died, and in that dead silence I heard it again. A slow, deliberate scritch, scritch, scritch against the fence. I sat up, breath hot in my throat, and watched thin fingers of mist slither between the palings. Then I saw them. Pale, mottled hands dragging themselves over the wood, clutching at each jagged edge. They didn't pull back when the light fell on them. Instead, they froze, claws raking slow grooves in the iron. My flashlight cut a beam out into the night, and for a moment the fingers clung to the fence skin stretched tight over bone, mottled with dark stains that might have been rot or earth. Then they slipped away, as though dissolving into the ground itself. My pulse hammered so loud I thought someone would hear it miles down the trail. I tried to start, the truck key turned, but only a single sputter. Then silence again, and that dragging noise migrated closer, echoing between the tombstones. I scrambled out, lantern in hand, and followed the sound. The graves looked taller in this wash of light, their marble cracked like open mouths. Then I saw the disturbance. One headstone stood pried aside, the earth around it heaved. Something had torn itself out, leaving a jagged void. A coffin lid flipped and splintered, nail heads glinting in the lantern glow. The bones hadn't been arranged. They lay scattered, broken, I turned to run back to the truck but tripped over something soft. A body, half buried, peeled back its ragged shroud and looked up at me, empty eye sockets leaking tears of mud. I dropped the lantern and it rolled across cracked gravel, illuminating more faces emerging from the ground, all clawing their way toward the gap in the fence. I heard them whisper, not in words but in a wet rasping that seeped into my ears. I staggered back, pressed against the truck's cold metal, and watched as dozens of gaunt corpses came into view, skin drawn tight, jawbone snapped loose, clothing rotted to fibers. I fumbled for the door handle, terror making my arms clumsy. The corpse nearest me lifted a hand, its fingernails long and dark as dried blood, and tapped on the window with a hollow knock. I flinched, slammed my fists against the glass, then saw its grin, a rictus of splintered teeth stained black. My scream died in my throat as it rapped again, and suddenly the truck roared to life. I slammed it in gear and tore down the road, headlights spitting gravel, but the fence faded into darkness behind me, and the scratching followed all the way. Scritch, scritch. Until the rising sun chased it away. I didn't stop. Until the pavement swallowed me, until Bonham's End was just a bad memory in my rearview mirror. I never told anyone what I saw who would believe a cemetery full of clawing dead. I locked the truck in my garage, the engine ticking as metal cooled, and for weeks I heard that tapping in every hollow space, the faint scrape of nails against wood, the rasp of breathing putrid with mud. I've tried to write it off as nightmares, but last night it came again, louder, against my bedroom wall. Now I sit here in the dark, staring at the old headstone propped against my door timber I swore I saw set aside in that moonlit graveyard. There's a smear of something dark on its face, soot or rot, I can't tell. And I hear it outside, beyond the wall, claws raking wood, eager to come back in. I keep the flashlight close, the engine key by my pillow, but I know it won't save me, because once the dead of Bonham's End have tasted sunlight, nothing can hold them down. And tonight, they're coming for me. I first heard the lullabies the night I drove past Ashwood on my way home from a busted tire in Blanco County. The moon was a sliver, and the longhorns pressed close to the barbed wire, their eyes reflecting pinpricks of starlight. I'd heard rumors a church burned to a skeleton in '52, children trapped inside, their prayers swallowed by roaring flames, and I'd half believe them. Like you half believe the ghastly postcards people send home from war. But when the wind shifted that midnight and a lullaby tumbled past my window, plain as a mother's whisper, I slammed on the brakes, heart hammering in my ribs. Walking up the rutted dirt road, the church loomed like a charred rib cage, its steeple fractured, pointing skyward like a broken finger accusing God. The air tasted of ash and something sweeter, like warmed milk left out too long. I pressed my hand to the charred doorframe and felt it glow faintly under my fingers, as if still alive with heat. The lullaby drifted again, two voices weaving a melody that tugged at muscles I didn't know I had, soft, longing, terribly sad. Hush, my darling. Came the refrain, syllables carried on a current of night, and I froze, remembering my niece back home, asleep in her crib, unaware of all the darkness that could reach out and find her. I circled the ruin, eyes adjusting to the hollows where windows once glowed with candlelight. The pews lay scattered, half buried in rubble. A shattered stained glass angel stared with one intact eye, its face half melted by flame. Every footstep raised a swirl of char, and I saw footprints too tiny, delicate prints pressed into the earth, leading up one side of the church wall, before fading as though the children had climbed straight into the night. My breath came fast, and I cocked my head, trying to place the lullaby's next line. It was a song my grandmother used to sing in Galveston when I was anxious as a child myself, and somehow that made it worse. The wind was singing to me, calling me back to a moment I'd buried long ago. Inside the nave, the air was thick and cold, as if the building still remembered the firestorm that consumed it. Puffs of dust trembled through empty rafters like spectral motes of memory. Then, from the altar's ruin where a cross once stood, the lullaby crescendoed soft voices, too close, echoing off blackened beams. I stumbled forward, boots scraping against a warped pew, and felt a pressure at my shoulder as if a child leaned there, seeking comfort. I spun around, flashlight slicing through the darkness, but all I saw were shadows drifting across the walls. Shifting shapes that never quite formed into bodies. My hand brushed against something on the floor. I knelt and lifted a fragment of porcelain once part of a Sunday best plate, now etched with a tiny, unbroken handprint. I shivered, and the wind soared through the roofless arch, carrying the chorus, "Sleep, my angel." 2 voices now, and then 4, and then a dozen, layering lullabies until the air pulsed with sorrow. I realized I'd been exhaling in time to their song, my heart following that slow, mournful rhythm. I tried to back away, but the church seemed to swell around me, walls bending inward, pressing their grief onto my shoulders. I forced myself to step outside, coughing as the chill hit my lungs. The lullabies faded into the night, but I heard footsteps behind me, quick and light, racing toward the road. I froze, heart in my throat, as small shapes emerged from the tree-lined dozens of children, their clothes singed and hair matted, faces pale as moonlight. Their eyes were hollow pits, yet in them I saw unquenchable longing. They lined up by the wreckage, shoulders straight, faces lifted to me, and they began to sing again, voices lifting into a dreadful, sweet chorus. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe while their song spun around me, like barbed wire pulling tighter with every verse. One of the children, a girl with a missing shoe and hair tangled in fine wire, pressed a hand against her throat and looked at me. I swear she mouthed the word home. In that moment, I felt every lost moment I'd ever buried, the fights I'd had with my mother, the times I'd forgotten to call my niece, the evening I walked out on my best friend's funeral without paying respects because I was afraid. Of memories. Their lullaby wasn't just a song. It was a verdict, naming every regret I'd kept locked away. I stumbled back, and the children advanced, hands reaching, fingertips grazing my jacket, leaving drops of cold dew on my skin. Their song rose into a science of heartbreak, sleep forever. They hummed now, drawing the melody out like a promise-turned knife. My flashlight bounced across broken pews and collapsed beams, but I saw nothing but their glowing faces. Drifting closer, lips moving in perfect harmony. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I realized the entire ruin was pulsing with them, a heart of ash beating beneath scorched stone. I turned on my heel and ran, branches slapping my arms. Moonlight catching on tears sliding down my cheeks. I didn't look back, but I heard the lullaby chase me down the road, growing fainter only when I slammed my truck door and locked it. The engine roared, tires spinning gravel, and I didn't stop until I was halfway to Johnson City, headlights slicing the dark. Even then, I sat in the cab, chest heaving, willing my pulse to calm. But when I rolled down the window to catch my breath, there it was again, a whisper carried on the wind, so soft I almost doubted I'd heard it. "Sleep, my darling?" I've slept little since that night. Every time I close my eyes I see their faces, those children lost to the blaze, voices echoing through my dreams. Last week, I found a scrap of charred fabric at my front door, a tiny shoe lining, singed at the edges, pressed into my welcome mat as though someone left it there. On purpose. I tried to burn it, but my lighter wouldn't work. I tried to bury it, but my shovel snapped at the handle. Now it sits on my bedside table, and sometimes, in the dead moments before dawn, I reach out and hold it, hoping it'll feel cold against my palm, hoping the lullaby will stop. but it never does. The wind still carries that song at midnight. Wherever I go, and I've come to know that some places never let you leave, not really. And some children, some souls never make it home. I came back to Blackwater Bluff on a humid July evening when the cicadas were droning so loud it felt like the earth was humming its own heartbeat. The river had always been dark black water bayou, they used to call it, tannin staining the current, to the color of iced tea gone bad, but that night the water looked wrong. Under the moonlight it glowed a dull crimson like a bruise spreading under skin. I pulled my truck off the rutted dirt road, the tires crunching over broken bottles and dry leaves, and stared at the bank where knotty cypress knees jutted from the mud. It wasn't red paint someone had dumped. That shade of red was too deep. 2 alive dot stories of drowned men rising were old as the graveyard. Just upstream back when the steam paddle wheel boats still chugged down river, unloading cotton bales. Folks said the dead came back to settle scores, dragging the living down into the black water depths. I remembered hearing my grandfather whisper about Aunt Clara, swept away as a girl, her arms reaching for him in the darkness before she vanished. We always thought it was just superstition. Until last week, when Jerry and his dog went out to check the crab traps by moonlight and never returned. They found the dog next morning on the bank, eyes flickered with that same sickly red reflection, fur matted with something that looked like blood but smelled of rotten leaves. Jerry was gone. No footprints led to the water's edge, no ripples along the bank. It was as if he'd walked clean through solid ground. The sheriff said maybe an alligator got him, but I know alligators don't leave dog carcasses on the shore without a fight. They drag their kills in the mud. That water was too calm. I tried to ignore it, but by the 3rd night the whole bayou was humming with whispers. Crickets stopped. Frogs stilled. Even the katydids held their breath. I could hear something moving in the shallows, like bones clicking underwater. Sometimes it sounded like a steady pull, as if the river was sucking in every floatable thing nearby. My skin prickled, like wet cotton brushing against raw flesh, every time I walked past the front porch. The whole town glared at me like I brought the curse with me. Maybe I did. My dreams turned red too. I'd wake sweating, hands reaching out of darkness, fingers clawing at my chest with cold nails. Always there was a face, half melted, eyes gone milky white, mouth stretched in a silent scream. The air tasted of iron and rot. I'd bolt upright in bed, heart slamming the ribs like a frightened animal, blood pounding in my ears so loud I thought I'd gone deaf. When Billy, the old grave digger, saw me in the general store, he spit tobacco juice into the sawdust floor and hawked a sigh. "You best stay away from that river at night," he told me, voice rough like gravel. Damn water turned traitor. Don't be the next one swallowed. His eyes were dark hollows. He didn't need to say more. That night I stood on the bank, flashlight in one hand, pistol in the other, though I knew no weapon would hold back whatever prowled those depths. The moon was full, fat, and yellow, hanging low in the sky like a watchful eye. The river reflected it as a hunting lantern, strobed by the slow drift of rotten leaves. I waited until exactly midnight. The moment the hour flipped, the waters surface rippled in concentric circles, though there was no breeze and no animal stirring. Then I felt it, a tug on my ankle through the cotton pants I wore. I froze, breath hitching, pistol dropping from my sweaty grip. Something beneath me was brushing my skin in gentle, coaxing strokes. I thought it was a rope at first, until I saw a pale hand break the surface, followed by another, joints white as bone peeking through the red water. Faces came next, dozens of them, bobbing like drowned dolls, hair floating like kelp, eyes locked on me with that vacant look. Their lips moved, but no sound broke the night. A low chorus of water sloshing, voices whispering names I'd never heard. They drifted toward me, fingers extended, beckoning. I stumbled back, but my foot sank into the mud and I pitched forward. The cold hit me instantly, like the blade of an ice pick pressed against my spine. My flashlight shattered, the beam slicing the air before flickering out. I clawed at the bank, lungs burning, but the ground was gone, just river dot hands closed around my ankles, pulling me down, tugging in synchronous rhythm like they'd rehearsed the move 1,000 times. I screamed, the sound swallowed by that living red mass. My arms thrashed, churning up mud and fallen leaves, my fingers scrabbling for purchase. Not here, I shouted in my mind. God, not here. But they were stronger, coiling around my legs, pulling me deeper, the water now up to my waist, then shoulders, stinging my lungs with each breath I attempted. As I went under, the current caught me, dragging me forward into the deepest bend of the bluff where the water rushed fastest. I felt bones brush mine, felt cold, wet laughter curling around my rib cage. My vision blurred, but in that haze I saw their faces clear as day boys and girls tangled in hair, grown men still clutching rosaries, women with faded gowns billowing in the current, all of them grinning with black holes where their mouths should have been. There was a second of silence, then the river exploded around me, bubbles churning as if the water itself was vomiting. I kicked, and broke the surface in a spray of red that stained my mouth, my lungs. I gulped air so hard my ribs cracked. I crawled onto a fallen log, shaking, vomiting up the bitter water. The moon spun overhead, and I thought I saw those faces watching me from the bank, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I ran, barefoot through briars and mud, until I reached the truck at dawn. The doors were locked, engine dead, tires flat. Behind me the bluff lay silent, the river calm again, black as night, hiding its secret. I didn't look back. I still carry that taste of iron in my mouth, that weight of cold limbs on my skin. They're waiting. And tonight, when the moon is full, the water will run red again. And if you live near Blackwater Bluff and you hear the river whisper your name, don't answer. Because if you do, they'll come for you and you'll vanish without a trace. Just another drowned soul returning to pull the next curious stranger beneath the currents. Dust hung in the air like a shroud as Cooper McAllister trudged across the parched expanse of his land, each boot sinking into a crust of earth so dry it cracked under his weight. He could taste the bitterness of the drought in the back of his throat, a flavor he'd come to know all too well since the creek had run foul. Tumbleweed Creek had once babbled through his cattle pastures, clear as glass, a ribbon of life spilling over smooth stones. But that was before he decided to save his herd and his livelihood by dumping the fertilizer laced with herbicide into the upstream channel. The promise of a bumper crop of alfalfa had seemed worth the risk until the water that nourished his land soured. The grass turned yellow along the banks, and the cattle grew thin and skittish. He told himself it was just coincidence, bug infestation, or a stray chemical spill from a passing rig, but at night, when the wind curled through the dry stalks of mesquite, he heard the whisper of guilt stirring in his mind like a restless thing. He came back each evening now to stare at the shallow trough carved by the dying water, imagining he could still see its silver glint if he squinted hard enough. But the stream bed was bone white under the moon's glare, cracked like a skull abandoned in the desert. And in the dead of night, he began to dream of hands reaching up from that bone-dry channel, clawing at the air with the desperation of the damned. He told himself it was just a dream, a fevered image born of worry and sleeplessness. But when he woke with his heart pounding and the sheets wet with sweat, he knew he had crossed a line. He had killed the creek, and in killing it, he had awoken something older than remorse. Late one April afternoon, when the sun hung low and red over the horizon, Cooper returned to the barn and found one of his old work gloves tossed near the trough's edge, dripping with water that shimmered dull green and oily black. He crouched beside it, letting the crumbling soil sift between his fingers, and felt a prickle run up his spine. The chemical stench was strong here, sickly sweet at first, then acrid, like burning plastic. He choked back a retch and hauled himself upright, scanning the empty fields. The ranch lay deserted beneath that sickly sky, the wind stirring tumbleweeds into miniature whirlwinds that rattled across the fence lines. A crow called somewhere to the east, its cry thin as a scream. Cooper swallowed hard, fighting the urge to bolt. He had too much to lose. But fate has a way of hunting men larger than their fears. That night the wind died to a hush, and the world felt uncomfortably still. Cooper sat on the porch under the lantern's weak glow, nursing a cheap whiskey, staring at the dry creek bed. 2 fields over. The moon was a pale coin dropped into the heavens, and as he watched the dusty expanse, he thought he saw movement just at the edge of his vision, where the dirt met the roots of an old cottonwood. He blinked, certain it was a trick of the light, but when he looked again, he saw it, 2 skeletal fingers breaking the surface, ivory white against the brown. He froze, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering at his feet. Fear nodded in his gut as the fingers wiggled, curling upward like the legs of a dead animal trying to escape its grave. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he felt the world hinge on that single image. They came slowly, one after another, wrists and forearms, rib cages hollowed by rot, ribs gleaming like bleached ivory. Dozens of them clawed there. Way out of the sand, rising until whole skeletons stood panting in motionless rows, their sockets empty and yet alive with accusation. They reached toward him as he stumbled backward, blood pounding in his ears. The lantern swung overhead, casting jittery shadows that danced like macabre marionettes. Cooper wanted to scream, but his voice died in his throat when he saw their heads tilt in unison, following his every move with silent demand. He fell to his knees, crawling away across the porch boards, splinters biting into his palms. The whiskey bottle lay shattered, its contents seeping into the wood. He wanted to plead for mercy, to tell them it was just business, that he'd done what he had to do to keep his family fed. But the skeletons pressed on, stepping into the moonlight, skeletal, feet stirring puffs of dust. The headlights of his truck shone in the distance, but every road that led to the highway seemed swallowed by the night. He reached the edge of the porch as the skeletons paused, as though granting him one last glance. In their hollow sockets, he felt the weight of soil-bound vengeance, ancient and unrelenting. He scrambled for his keys, hands shaking so badly he could barely hold them. Behind him, the lantern light flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled at the doorknob until finally the truck's engine roared to life, its beam sweeping across the yard, but the creek bed beyond was empty once more, bone white under the moon. He gripped the wheel, hard hammering, and peeled away. In a cloud of dust, leaving the porch light swinging in a solitary arc dot in the days that followed, Cooper tried to carry on, but he was a man undone. Sleep eluded him, and when exhaustion finally claimed him, nightmares stole him away to the dry channel, where skeletal hands tore at his flesh, dragging him down into that parched grave. His wife found him one morning at the foot of the trough, curled in a fetal position, eyes wide and vacant, speaking gibberish about the creek's children. She pressed for answers, and he told her the truth in a voice so hollow she thought him mad. She begged him to seek help, to confess at the church or call in the authorities, but Cooper knew that some debts could not be paid in confessions or courtroom judgments. The tributaries of guilt ran deeper than law, and the creek could not be cleansed by words alone. That spring, the rains were scarce, but on the second night after the full moon, the wind picked up, and the temperature dipped until the air tasted of kinship with winter's bone. Cooper lay in bed listening to the creak of the old house settling, the whisper of the wind through cracked windows promising what was to come. He felt it in his bones, a summons older than any man's making. Before dawn, he rose and dressed in silence, stepping outside into a world held in suspense. The moon hung low, the stars veiled by a thin haze, as he walked toward the creek bed, lantern in hand, each step a reluctant acceptance of his fate. When he reached the trough, he raised the light and dropped it at the edge, lantern blazing. Like a beacon, he looked into the hollow channel and spoke the words he'd feared to utter. "I'm sorry," but the wind swallowed them. Then the ground trembled, softly at first, then violently, until the earth cracked open along the dried channel. From that fissure came the sound of rattling bones, the scrape of skeletons waking from a slumber measured in centuries. Cooper knelt at the gaping maw, hands clasped as though in prayer, though he had no faith left to call upon. The skeletal hands rose, dozens of them, until they reached his knees, then elbows, then shoulders. He looked up at the sky, half expecting dawn, but the world remained cast in moonlight. A hand closed around his boot, another around his wrist, and the rest gripped his ankles like the roots of some unholy tree. He stood, carried by the inexorable pull of their grip, lifted from the earth and carried into the channel. The skeletons formed a procession, arcing his body like an offering as they advanced toward the heart of the creek bed. Cooper mumbled apologies, tears carving tracks through the dust on his cheeks, but the skeletons did not hear his pleas. They felt only their ancient hunger for justice. They reached the deepest hollow, where the water had pooled only in memory, and there they lowered him. Sand sifted through their bony fingers, burying him up to his waist. He felt the chill of that burial, the suffocating press of earth against his chest, the world narrowing to a strip of pale sky above. The skeletons knelt in a circle, leaning inward until their skulls almost touched, and in their empty throats he heard a sigh that sounded like the wind through dried reeds. Then they rose and filed away silently, leaving him to the stillness, the promise that they would return each spring until the creek ran clear or his grave was filled. Dawn broke without fanfare. A smudge of pink on the horizon. The ranch lay quiet, the creek bed a smooth plain of bleached earth, untouched by tire tracks or footprints. Inside the house, his wife stirred, noticed the lantern gone, and sensed the absence of his weight beside her. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, her gaze drifting to the dry channel. There, at the heart of Tumbleweed Creek, she saw something half buried in the sand, a boot, old leather, rotted and frayed, with a solitary downturned spur. She knelt and brushed the dust away from a name stamped on the sole, C. McAllister. She whispered his name, but the wind offered no answer, and the creek bed remained silent as a grave. I drove into Mercy's Crossing just as the sun was dragging its last orange fingers across the scrubby horizon, and the promise of relief weighed heavy in my heart. My sister, Anne-Marie, lay barely breathing back home pneumonia that no doctor could cure, the blue of her lips a cruel reminder of time slipping away. They said Mercy's Crossing had a spring, a cold, clear pool hidden down a narrow ranch road, where the water could banish fever and mend broken bones. Folks whispered that the price was high, but worth it if you were desperate enough. I was. The town itself was little more than a scattering of dust-choked shacks, a boarded-up general store, and a corroded sign that read, Mercy's Crossing Population 27. Beyond that, mesquite and yucca stretched to the horizon, and the cicadas buzzed with a strange urgency. I parked beneath a lone live oak that jutted from the dirt like a warped sentinel. A woman in faded overalls sat on a sagging porch, rocking slowly, her eyes creased and clouded with age. I asked her for directions to the spring, and she tipped her head toward the east. "Half a mile," she croaked. "Past the fence, Through the wash, but you best turn back. Ain't nothing good here but the water, and that asks for its due. I told her I understood. I lied, I didn't understand. I just trudged on, boots puffing dust as the road narrowed into a goat track. The wind carried voices that weren't their laughing children, murmurs of mourning, a woman's sob and a man's curse. I paused, heart thundering, but the hush of the scrub reclaimed me, and I pressed forward. Every sense stretched taut. I found the fence, a tangle of rusted barbed wire drooping like a noose, and crawled beneath. The wash was bone-white sand, compacted and cracked by summer heat. Beneath my feet, it felt alive, shifting like the creak of old wood. Then I saw it, the spring gurgling from a fissure in the rock, water clear as glass in a basin sculpted by time. The rim of the pool was rimmed with stained saffron and copper that glinted in the last light. I knelt, cupped the water, drank. It was icy fire in my throat, sweet and sharp, like memory and regret distilled. In that moment, I felt the fever drain from my bones. The world sharpened a distant hawk, the dance of mesquite shadows. I closed my eyes, lifted my face to a sky bruised purple, and thought of Anne-Marie's laughter as a child, her sunburned cheeks. I thought she'd live. Somewhere a whippoorwill called, and I startled. When I blinked, the pool's surface rippled, and the stains around the edge seemed to quiver. The air hummed as if breathing. I looked down at my hands, clean. I sighed and bent to refill. That's when I saw the footprints. Tiny, bare prints, wet and glittering, leading from the edge of the spring, delicate as a child's. They traced a slow arc, then vanished into the scrub. I stilled. My mind leapt to the woman's warning. The spring asked for its due. I wanted to run, but something held me. Curiosity, horror, fear. I followed the prints a dozen yards, then found hair dark, matted, and a scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn. Pale linen, embroidered with tiny roses like those my grandmother used to keep. I knelt, heart pounding, and touched the linen. It smelled of damp earth and decay. The sun had dipped below the horizon completely now, and the western sky bled into night. I heard a rustle and spun. Nothing. I heard a whisper and spun again. The chill of night settled, and the world felt too large, too still. I gathered the scrap and stumbled back to the spring, mind racing. I should leave. I should tell someone. But I needed proof, something to explain why I would risk it, and because Anne-Marie needed proof that I'd done everything. I sank to my knees and drank again, faster this time, gulping until the pool was almost still. The air vibrated. The stains pulsed. The footprints returned, curling around the basin, deeper now. Then the water shuddered, and a shape stirred beneath the surface, a pale arm, slender fingers. My breath caught. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam wobbling as I snapped it on. In the beam, the pool was empty. No arm, no hand. Just water, trembling so violently ripples raised from the center. I shone the light around. Jagged stones, tufts of grass, the fence a dark skeleton. I looked back to the water. The light refracted and warped, and for a second, the pool was a yawning mouth, black and infinite. Then it was just the pool again. I scrambled to my feet, gagging. Something had tried to pull me in. My pulse thundered. I backed away, fell through the fence, pitched forward into the sand, skidding to a halt. The spring called after me, soft, beckoning, insistent. But I ran. By the time I reached my truck, the sky was a vault of stars. I fumbled with the door, slammed it shut, and the engine roared to life. The headlights cut swaths through the dark as I raced back toward town, the road twisting until I spotted the porch with the rocking woman. I skidded to a stop. She sat motionless now, not rocking, head bowed. I leapt out. "They're missing," I gasped. "Children." Someone else. The water. My words tumbled into silence as the porch creaked, not with rocking, but as if the whole house drew breath. The woman raised her head. Her eyes were the same milky gray, but now filled with something ancient and hungry. "Drank twice," she said, voice hollow as driftwood. "First time, it takes sickness. Second time, it takes life." I staggered back. "What, how?" "I didn't." "Please, tell me what you know." She stood. The porch groaned, planks bending under her weight. Mercy's Crossing was built on this spring. We drank to heal, yes, but our blood bought it. Children. Born here never leave. We keep them safe in the spring's arms. Every year, Mercy chooses her toll. Her words sank in like ice. I looked back down the road, no lights, no houses, just the black of prairie. I turned to her, voice trembling. "How many?" She tilted her head. "Too many." Then she bared her teeth in a slow smile. "Nearly me, nearly you." I fled across the porch, kicked open the truck door, and slammed it. As I fumbled for the keys, the porch light flickered on. I looked up. She stood framed in yellow glow, her eyes shining like stars fallen to earth. Behind her, the scrub shifted. Tiny figures emerged, silent, slick with water. Children, their eyes dark hollows, feet bare, hair clinging to pale cheeks. They drifted down the steps, footsteps silent. The wind carried their whispers. "Please, please, come back." I turned the key, tires spinning. The truck leapt forward, and I barreled down the road, the spring's laughter echoing in my skull. By the time I reached town's edge, headlights in. My mirror snapped on. The entire town windows lit, doors open, faces pressed against glass. They followed me, a silent procession. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The spring's memory seared my veins, a promise of relief and death entwined. Mercy's Crossing faded behind me, a cluster of lights swallowed by night. But the spring had already marked me twice. My sister would live, yes, but someday, its hunger would find me. And when it did, there would be no running, no mercy. The first time I heard her scream, it was as though the wind itself had broken its own bones. I was parked half a mile down the gravel road that led up to Widow's Rust, the old Thompson place where locals swore the air twisted and trembled. Around the manor like a living thing. I'd come alone, just me, my recorder, and the single headlamp slung over my shoulder chasing the story I'd pitched to that small town paper. Bride's scream haunts abandoned Texas manor. The sun had dipped behind the pines by the time I arrived, and the sky was receding into shades of bruised purple. Widow's Rest sat at the top of a gentle hill, its white paint peeling in sheets, the windows dark as empty eye sockets. The porch sagged as though weighed down by something unseen. I stepped off the road onto the yard where grass had grown tall enough to hide the foundation stones, and every broken shutter and fallen board seemed to watch me. The air smelled of rot and cedar. I paused at the bottom of the steps, heart thundering. In my ears, they said that in 1928, Mrs. Lillian Thompson waited in her bridal gown for her husband, Nathaniel, to return from a nearby hunting trip. He never came back. Some said the bayou had claimed him. Others whispered that Lillian herself had done something unspeakable and thrown his body into the manor cistern. But no body was ever found. They told of her screams at midnight, blood-curdling, howls that rattled the whole county, and then silence. When curious neighbors came calling, they found the house empty, the gown draped over a chair, the bride's face stained with decades-old tears. And not a trace of either her or Nathaniel. I pressed record and climbed the stairs, the wood groaning beneath my weight. The door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it the rest of the way open and stepped inside. The hallway stretched before me, dark, except for the beam of my headlamp. Wallpaper, once pale yellow, now hung in long strips, curled like dead skin. The air was colder than it should have been. I set up my camera near the grand staircase, its banister carved like twisting vines. As I clicked on the night vision mode, a faint echo drifted down the hall like a sob, half drowned by time. I stood, listening. The silence pressed in, then behind me, an unmistakable crack, the sound of footsteps on fragile wood. Hello? I choked out, voice hollow. No answer. My recorder caught nothing but the static pulse of the old wiring. I brushed it off. Old houses make noises. I edged forward, sweeping my light across the parlor. A grand piano stood in one corner, keys yellowed and some missing. On the mantel above the fireplace, a cracked portrait of a bride in a tea-length. Dress stared back with painted eyes that seemed too lifelike. I crossed to it, drawn to her. Dust motes danced in the beam. When I brushed the frame, I felt a whisper of heat, a breath on my neck, and the faintest scrape at my shoulder, as if a skeletal hand had traced the seam of my jacket. My breath hitched. I spun around, nothing. I laughed, a bark of nerves, and tapped the portrait. Lillian? Is that you? Silence. Then, from somewhere upstairs, I heard a soft, wet sob. It came again, and louder this time, a ragged sound that knotted my stomach. I swallowed hard, forced myself to climb the staircase. Each step was slick with what looked like a thin film of something dark. Moonlight slanted through a broken window, pooling on the landing. I paused there, my light scanning the hallway. At the top, doors lined both sides, their edges rotted away. The sobbing seemed to come from the far end. I moved toward it, heart hammering. My headlamp flickered. Ahead, a door stood closed, its paint blistered. The sobbing was louder now, anguished, desperate. I placed my hand on the knob, cold and damp, and turned it. Inside was the bedroom. Wide, dusty, dominated by a four-poster bed draped in cobwebs. A wedding dress lay sprawled across the mattress, stained with brownish red that had long since stiffened. The sobbing was coming from the closet. I swallowed again, edged forward, and pulled the door open. The closet was empty save for a single boot, a man's boot, scuffed and old-fashioned, lying on the floor. And then I felt it, a weight in the far corner, a presence crouched low. My light settled on a dark shape. It was a man's torso, slumped against the back wall. His skin was a bluish gray, eyes sunken and glassy. Decay had claimed him. My breath froze. He looked at me. His lipless mouth stretched into a grin. Then he opened his mouth and screamed. Not the bride's scream, but another voice rasping. Hungry? I stumbled back, chest heaving, and the corpse lurched forward, clawing at the air. I turned and fled, tumbling down the stairs. The echo of a woman's scream chasing me. Long, wailing, impossible. It wrapped around the walls, seeped through the floorboards, and rattled the windows. I burst through the front door into the night, the scream chasing me down the porch steps, across the lawn, and into the pines. I didn't stop until I slammed into my car, breath ragged, heart wild. My recorder lay on the passenger seat. I grabbed it, hit stop, hit play. For a second, there was nothing but static. Then, her scream, high, keening, echoing so powerfully that the car shook. It ended. In a suffocated sob, I peeled out down the gravel, leaving the manor and its horrors behind. The recorder I kept in my lap, and of course I listened. The scream was on the tape, clear as day, but underneath it something else, a softer voice, whispering, "Find him, bring him back." I didn't know if it was Lillian or something else that spoke, but I know what that means. Nathaniel's body is still here, and she's waiting. The next night, I'll go back, and I'll bring a shovel, maybe even a priest. Because I heard her plea, and I know I can't leave it unanswered. Widow's Rest won't let me go until I find him. And I'm afraid that when I do, Nathaniel won't be the only thing that comes out of that cistern. He pulled off Highway 62, just as the sun tipped its last rays behind the mesquite and began the slow slide into violet dusk, his old Chevy's engine ticking like a recoil after a gunshot. The sign said, Coyote Flats Next Services 45 miles. Weathered wood and bullet holes leaning like a drunk man against its post. He needed gas, but mostly he needed to stop the shaking in his hands. He'd been on the road since sunrise, chasing ghosts of what he'd left behind in Amarillo memories, wrapped in barbed wire and half-whispered apologies. His eyes were red, his shoulders tight, and the desert around him seemed to whisper, as if the scrub and rocks shared some secret he couldn't yet hear. He climbed out and stretched, boots sinking into the hot sand that already held the evening chill. The wind carried a scent he couldn't name, dried blood or perhaps old rot. He opened the glove box for his flashlight and found only a crumpled receipt. In the hush, he heard it, a low, mournful keening, rising and falling like someone strangled, through a throat full of dust. Coyotes, he thought, but something in the tone scraped at his spine, too human, too longing, too afraid. He closed his eyes and the sound shifted, coming closer, drifting over the dunes. He glanced at the pump rusted, empty, the digits frozen at all zeros. No place here for nightmares, he told himself. But the tears at the corners of his eyes weren't from wind. He flicked the flashlight on and swept it across the desert floor. Nothing, just shadows among shadows. He followed the sound, each keening bend dragging him further away from the highway, further from any hope of help. Wind whispered through the mesquite, and he thought he heard voices, snatches of laughter, a child's sob, a man cursing his own name. He patted his pocket for his phone. Dead. The screen was black, a pane of bone against the gathering dark. He clicked his tongue and set off, flashlight bobbing across the yawning emptiness. The sand was cold here, despite the day's heat. Every footstep left an imprint that looked too small, like someone else's print beside his own. He glanced back and saw them. 2 tracks, one his, one narrower, dragging side by side. He shivered, imagining some wretched thing trailing him. The howls rose again, so close he thought they were in his skull, rattling his teeth. He felt something brush against his calf, a tongue of air or the tail of a coyote. He spun, light slicing the gloom, and froze. There, 30 feet away, a cluster of bones lay half buried in the sand, bleached white, bleached clean. A skull, its jaw gaping in a silent scream. And around them, dozens of small, charred paw prints, as if the desert itself had stepped across these remains. He swallowed, his throat tight. He backed away, but the footprint beside his remained, as if something had stopped beside him only inches from his boot. He kept walking, flashlight flickering between grit that looked almost like snow and stones glittering like shards of glass. He thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a flash of a jacket, a hat, someone standing beyond the next ridge. He aimed the beam. Nothing. The howls cut off, replaced by a silence so complete his ears popped. He held his breath. And then a voice. "Why you here?" Soft, gravelly, accented like a man who learned kindness in prison. His heart hammered. He swallowed. "Just passing through," he said. His voice sounded wrong, metallic. Not many pass through. The voice was right beside him now. He turned. No one. He spun back. No footprints joined his own. No shape hovered in the dark. He clicked his torch higher. Light flared over a ring of stone set in the sand like the remnants of a campfire, only no char or ash. Just stones arranged in a crude circle, half buried. He flicked the light upward to find the coyote howls start again, this time to his left. They sounded triumphant, as if the pack had him now. His blood turned to ice. He ran. He crossed the shallow wash he'd walked beside earlier, sand giving way to pebbles that rattled underfoot. He stumbled, nearly falling. The flashlight tumbled, the beam cutting a ragged arc before he snatched it back. At the edge of a dry arroyo, he stopped. The howls fell silent. He stared down into the rocky ditch. He thought he saw worlds of movement breath. In the air, a coil of shadow slithering away. He turned to climb the bank and heard it, a low chuckle, the sound of bones clicking together. His pulse roared in his ears. He darted up the bank, light leaking sand like water. At the top, the desert, stretched purple and empty under a sky starless with cloud. He pocketed the torch and fished for his keys, trying the door. Locked. He bent down, found a rock, and smashed the passenger window. Glass exploded inside, tiny diamonds biting his hand. He slid across the seat and started the engine. The dash. Lights blinked dimly and the engine coughed, then roared to life. He shifted gears and backed toward the highway, trying not to look into the desert where the truck's headlights cut living shapes out of the gloom dot as he turned the corner onto the blacktop. The howls rose one last time, a broken chorus of agony. And hunger. He stomped on the gas. The tires spun and the Chevy lurched forward. In his rearview mirror he saw them, ghostly coyote shapes at the edge of the beams, silhouettes perched on the dune like mourners at an open grave. Their eyes glowed red in the headlights. He drove faster, wind whipping the broken glass, until the flat plain was nothing but a smear of dark dot at dawn. Some trucker spotted the wreck on the side of Highway 62. One shattered window, tire tracks. That led into the desert and stopped abruptly 50 yards from the road. No bodies, no sign of him. Only footprints, his and another set, too small and too straight to be animal. And out there, in the shifting sand, lay bones scattered like broken promises, white and glinting, whispering that some journeys end not with a grave, but something far older, something that feeds on fear and leaves only a hollow, echoing howl. The desert night presses close against your skin, a dry weight that seeps into your bones the moment you step off the rickety platform of Lone Pine Station. The moon hangs low behind thin clouds, pale as bleached bone, and the wind carries. A dying hiss through the broken windows of the depot. You came chasing rumors of a telegraph line still humming with life, something impossible in a place this remote. The sign on the splintered door reads Lone Pine, letters fading into the wood like scars. Inside, the air tastes of rust and rot. Floorboards creak beneath your boots, each groan echoing through the empty hall. You sweep your flashlight across battered benches and peeling posters that once advertised. Stagecoach schedules, black and white images of travelers smiling wide, horses kicking up dust. Now the paint curls away from the walls, and the only movement is the dust motes drifting like tiny specters. At the heart of the room stands the telegraph apparatus, brass levers tarnished green, wires coiling like vipers into the floor. Its key is still there, the rubber grip worn smooth dot. You press your palm against the machine. A sudden gust rattles. The windows and the entire station seems to exhale as though it has been holding its breath for a century. The wind rattles the glass until it finally shatters, a sharp crack that reverberates like a pistol shot. You stumble back, heart hammering, and for a moment you taste fear on your tongue, pure, metallic and cold. Then, faint at first and barely more than a tremor through the wires, comes the tapping. 1, pause. 2, pause. 3, longer pause. You lean forward, eyes flicking between the key and the wall-mounted speaker above. The sound grows more insistent, mechanical. A sequence of dits and das that spell out a message, but not in Morse. The staccato rhythm is wrong, uneven, as if the sender's hand was shaking. You clasp the lever and pull it toward you. There. Coming. The machine clicks, the words repeating over and over. Each cycle slows, drags, the final syllables drawing out into an agonized moan that seeps into your skull. The phrase warps, stuttering until it becomes a scream that you can almost hear behind your ears. You yank free, and the key tumbles from your fingers, clattering across the wooden floor. Silence returns, thick and sudden as midnight. You wouldn't have believed that a telegraph could speak if you hadn't heard it yourself. You feel eyes on your back, though you know you're alone. Your flashlight beam sweeps the darkness, and somewhere beyond the threshold the desert wind shifts, whispering secrets you can't decipher. A strange compulsion drags you past the counter, and down the narrow corridor that leads to the operator's office. The door hangs ajar, its hinges rusted but still groaning. Inside, the desk is littered with yellowed paper and a half-empty cup of coffee long gone cold. Ink splotches stain the blotter. A ledger lies open, each line scored through in jerky. Handwriting. At the bottom of the page, beneath the last entry, the words "they're coming" are scrawled repeatedly until the ink bleeds into the paper, forming a black blot the size of a fist. You lean closer, trying to make out a date or a name, but the blot is too fresh, too deep to be old. You scrape at it with a fingernail and the surface peels away in a curl of charcoal and dust. Beneath, carved into the wood in neat, precise letters, is the operator's final message. They're coming. Your heart leaps into your throat as a sudden chill drifts through the room. The door behind you slams shut. The flashlight flickers and dies, plunging you into darkness so complete it feels like a living thing. You fumble in your pocket for a lighter, strike it once, twice nothing. Panic claws at your ribs. You pound on the door, voice cracking as you scream, "Let me out." On the other side of the door, the slow, deliberate scratch of fingertips. 1, 2, 3, pause. And then answering voice, low and hollow, as though it comes from the grave itself. "They're here." You freeze, every muscle locked. In terror, the lighter ignites in your hand, its weak flame showing only the bottom half of the door. You see scratches gouged into the wood, deep enough to reveal pale splinters beneath the dark surface. The ragged marks snake downward, as if something hungry has been clawing to get in. Behind you, the wind returns with a sharp whistle, rattling the once shattered window frames. Through the dusty panes you think you see shapes moving, tall silhouettes that sway at the edge of the platform like trees in a storm. But there are no trees here, only the endless stretch of desert. The lighter flickers and goes out. The dark grows thicker, the air vibrating with a low frequency that you feel in your chest. You press your back against the door, trembling, as the scratching increases, now accompanied by a slow, wet sliding sound like something dragging itself across the wood. A single whisper rises above it all, sounding close enough to touch your ear. "Don't." The door bursts inward in a splintering crash. You stumble backward, lighter skittering across the floor. In the sudden blaze of matchlight you see them, two figures, bowed and ragged, shapes that could be men but with skin stretched. Tight across hollow cheekbones, eyes glowing faintly like embers. Their mouths hang open in a silent scream. They're dressed in tattered clothes that might have been late 19th century work shirts, smudged with dust and dried blood. They collapse onto the desk, skeletal hands reaching for the ledger, scanning the page where the words repeat in ink and wood. They tilt their heads in unison, and you realize they're listening to the station, to each other, to something you cannot hear. One raises a finger and taps the telegraph key. A single, agonized click echoes in the room. Then another. And another, building into a maddening rhythm that drowns out even your racing thoughts. You turn to run, but the corridor is gone only. A wall of splintered wood and bone-white faces inches from your own. The key clicks in your ear. They're coming. You close your eyes against the whispering wind, and when you open them again, there is nothing but sand drifting through the shattered windows. The station is empty once more, the telegraph silent, far off. A train whistles through the desert night, no schedules, no passengers, no one to answer its call. But you know the message still drifts on the wind, carried across the plains and into the darkness. They're coming. They never heard the collapse, not at first. The ground sheared off like rotten wood one moment, then darkness swallowed them all, and only the shudder of the earth and the screams of men thrown by rock told them what had happened. When Thomas Reed pried his eyelids open, he saw splinters of timber and greasy clay piled against the lantern he dropped. The weak flame sputtered as though remembering light. He coughed, tasting dust, iron, and that unmistakable stink of something old and hungry. His wrist stung where glass had cut him when the lamp shattered, so he wrapped his hand in his shirt and groped for the matches in his pocket. One flick, and there was a dull yellow glow, barely enough to paint the walls in trembling strokes. The tunnel groaned behind him, shifting. He swallowed around the pain in his mouth. Teeth rattled loose somewhere in the heap behind him, grinding against each other as though some unseen jaw had crunched them. He froze, and everything in that moment felt alive. The dripping of water through new cracks overhead, shifting dust motes dancing in the lantern's grip, bits of broken bone tangled in roots wedged into the ceiling. What presses down beneath the earth, Thomas thought, leaning his cheek to the gritty rock, must have waited a long time for this. He did not call out to the other men. Something about calling would make the world listen for an answer. Instead, he edged forward on hands and knees until the passage widened enough for him to stand. One leg pressed against an iron rail, dislodging the cart stuck on the upturned track. The lantern swung in his fist like a heartbeat. He could taste the fear in the air, acrid and metallic. He scanned the walls. Carvings that weren't there when he'd come in. Deep twisting lines gouged into the stone like nails scraped across. Bone. Their edges were sharp, cruel, and crowded so tight the whole face of the cavern looked barbed. He fancied he heard whispers around him, carried by the water droplets tinkling in the gloom. But when he stopped, it was silent except for his own ragged breath. He crawled onward, the rail guiding him deeper, each footfall echoing hollowly. The mine's back chambers were old hand dug in the earliest days of Redstone Ridge before. Steam drills and steel beams. That was why the collapse happened. The supports were that rotten. But it wasn't just timber giving way. Something else had moved those rocks, something alive. He passed an old blasting cap box, its wood split open, and the barrels of gelignite spilled out like great pale eggs. Ragged scraps of cloth dangled from the timbers, stained brown and slick. He wondered what he wouldn't want to find here, and the thought made his scalp tighten. The tunnel forked. Reed pressed himself against the left wall, peering down a narrow vein slick with water. The lantern revealed a patchwork of claw marks that started low, as though a man had crawled there on all fours, then climbed higher, ending in a gouge above his head. Beneath that, a shimmer in the water. He knelt, bracing his lantern on a rock, and watched. The water's surface rippled without wind. Something slithered beneath, pale and sinuous. He eased his hand back. Every instinct screamed to run, but somewhere in the darkness the rail beckoned him toward the right fork. His wounded hand throbbed. The tunnel there arched upward, bringing him into a rough-hewn cavern where the ceiling had collapsed to form a dome of gray stone, scarred by centuries of pressure. Here, the air was cooler, stale, and wet. He shook the lantern. The flame danced through weird shadows that looked like figures bowing in a circle. He swallowed. He heard a shift behind him and turned, but no one was there. Then he saw it, a shining eye on the far wall, perched too high for any man. It pulsed with wet light. Next to it, a patch of flesh peeled from the stone, like a living layer beneath it quivered. Reed's throat went dry. He raised his lantern until it crackled, burning too fiercely, and in that fierce flare he saw a thing crouched in the corner. It was roughly humanoid, limbs too long, arms bent backward at strange angles, skin pale as damp clay, and the head was way too large for its thin neck. A guttural sound rattled in its throat, like heavy rocks grinding. Then it moved, too fast for its broken body. It folded down the wall and landed with a wet slap. Reed stumbled back, lunging with the lantern. The creature shrieked, a sound like steel tearing flesh. He swung the lamp at its face. Glass shards sprayed everywhere. A gout of flame erupted, and the creature howled, a sound that curled the hair on his arms. He bolted for the tunnel, dragging himself on the rail, not daring to look back. His blood pounded in his ears. Every breath was a battle. Behind him, the creature screamed and gave chase, its claws clicking on the rock. He clutched his hand, warm and wet. He risked a glance. The thing was half in shadow, half in flame, moving like a ragdoll pulled by a mad puppeteer. Reed scrambled over debris, his legs numb. The tunnel narrowed, rusted beams pinching him like a vice. He wrenched his body forward, ribs banging against splintered wood. His lantern slipped. It clattered and rolled, flame guttering low. He heard the click of claws, smelled that sulfuric stink again. He dove to snatch the lamp, only to find a second creature waiting in the gloom, eyes locked on him like broken mirrors. They lunged together. Reed howled and spun, holding the lamp between them like a shield. The creatures recoiled, smoke curling from their charred skin. He stepped past them, heart slamming against his ribs. Then he saw a sliver of light ahead, not the orange pool of his lamp, but sunlight, pale and impossibly soft. He ran, every step a prayer. Behind him, stone sheared off the tunnel wall. The creatures roared, but he didn't look back. He burst through the final opening, blinded by noon, dust and pebbles raining down. He slid onto his back on the hillside, earth cold against his cheek, lungs burning. He heard the cave moan shut behind him, sealing the beasts back into there. Tongue-dead he lay there, panting, watching clouds drift across the sky. Hours later, a rescue team found him, haggard, covered in blood, his own and something else's. They carried him away uphill, and as they passed the entrance, one of the men knelt, shining a light inside. The lantern's glow died against the stone. The cave was empty. No signs of collapse remained, no tracks, no bones. Only those claw marks gouged in the rock, deeper than before, as though carved by hands insisting that something be remembered. Thomas Reed squeezed his eyes shut against the daylight. Whatever lived beneath Redstone Ridge had surface fellows enough to hush any story at a glance. He would never speak its name again. Yet he felt it, as he would forever feel that steady pulse beneath his ribs, the itch under his skin that whispered in the dead of night, "It's still in the tunnels, still carving its mark, and someday it will find a way out again." I kept the cab's heater throttled low against the desert night's chill. Though inside the old Dodge Charger I could have sworn I felt sweat slick against my skin. The road had been barren for miles. High mesas lining the horizon, their shadowed crests carved by wind that never rested. I was chasing ghosts, rumors of a place called Silverfall, where an assay office from the 1880s still stood, its rusted sign swaying on a single iron chain. Locals said quicksilver oozed from the cracks in its foundations, pooling in dented pails, and shallow basins set across the floor. And they said any man who drank from those silvered wells lost more than his reason, he lost his soul. I didn't believe it until I saw the shards of metal plates glimmering in my headlights. like 100 bleary eyes staring back, and then I saw the first drip, a bead of mercury curving slow as a whispered prayer before it fell, splashing into a tin cup with the hollow sound of bone on wood. The door groaned when I pushed, and inside the office the air was thick with the scent of old ore and rust, sharp as a butcher's blade. My boots sank into a slick film of quicksilver that spread across the plank floor, sending reflections twisting like drowned faces. I squatted beside one of the pails, struck by how the silver trembled as if alive. Then I saw my own reflection dissolving, the eyes melting into liquid light, and in that instant I tasted metal behind my gums and a whisper tickled my ear. "Come closer." I stood and backed away, heart hammering in my throat, but the walls seemed to narrow, corralling me into the center. I raised my flashlight and it flickered, the beam dancing across old manifest ledgers yellowed with age, their pages marked in letters that shifted when I tried to focus one moment, an inventory of gold dust. The next, a tally of souls drained from drifters and desperados who'd come seeking fortune. The mercury dripped again, higher this time, as if reaching for the ceiling beams blackened with soot. Each drip echoed in the hollow room, and I swear I heard a soft lament, like a choir of men once free now bound in silver prisons. Panic bloomed in my chest, and I stepped toward the door, but the floor groaned and I slipped, skidding into a pool so deep it swallowed my ankle with a cold kiss. Pain lanced through my leg as tremors crawled up my spine. I froze, breath rasping. Then I saw footprints in the mercury barefoot impressions that led from a low hatch under the ledger table. Tiny human forms trailing away into darkness. I rose on shaking legs, the beam of my flashlight straining to penetrate the gloom beneath the floorboards. Something about that hatch called to me, a low hum vibrating through my teeth. I gripped the hatch's iron latch and pulled. The boards fell away with a groan that felt like the world's last breath. Beneath lay a narrow tunnel slick with mercury, lit by its own glow as the metal clung to the rough stone walls, casting wavering shapes that looked like bodies convulsing in perpetual agony. The smell of sulfur and decay rose up, making my stomach lurch. I hesitated, rational mind screaming to flee, but my legs moved of their own accord, drawing me forward. Each step sent ripples of silver across the tunnel floor. Each breath tasted like poison. Then I heard something scuttle ahead, soft, wet, deliberate like claws on stone. My flashlight found something crouched in the distance, a figure, hunched and slick. It lifted its head, revealing eyes like molten silver, pupils gone. It opened its mouth, wider than any human jaw, and from its throat came not a scream but a bell's chime, deep and resonant. My knees buckled. I stumbled back, but the tunnel behind me had vanished, replaced by relentless wall. There was only forward. I forced my body on, choking down terror, until I came to a chamber where dozens of pails lined the perimeter, each filled with mercury so bright it burned my vision. And there, pinned to the far wall by a jagged rock, was a man, his skin taut and glassy, veins shining with quicksilver, eyes rolled back, his mouth hung in an eternal gasp. I recognized him then as one of the travelers I'd passed on the highway. Earlier that morning, car stranded, thumb out, desperate for a lift. I'd offered him water before I'd noticed the dull bruise around his wrist where the office's proprietor had shackled him, and he refused help, spat out a curse about never letting go of what one desires most. Now he looked like a puppet made of silver, strings of mercury binding every joint. The chime came again, but I realized it was the dripping, one drop echoing into a pail, and it sounded like a tolling bell summoning me into the pail's reflectant depths. My throat went dry. I pressed my lips to the nearest rim and drank. Mercury sliding down my throat cold as death. Images flashed. The assay office's ledger flipping open to names I had never written. My own fingerprints smudged across its pages. I saw my mother's face, torn by grief. I saw children I'd never have, and graves filled by my own ash. A voice, low and confident, whispered that it would carry me beyond pain, beyond fear. I felt myself dissolving into that silver haze, my arms loosening, my mind spilling like mercury down a drain. Then, a roar behind me. The chamber split open, and bright beams of headlight cut through the gloom. The proprietor's rattling laugh echoed from above, promising me to the office's hunger. My hand shot out and gripped the ledge as a booted foot stomped down, pressing my face into a pail's brim. The liquid surged, lapping at my lips. I opened my mouth to scream but tasted nothing but metal. The world spun, light fracturing into 100 blades of silver, and it felt like falling backward into an endless night. Then silence. When I woke, I was back outside, collapsed on the cracked asphalt of Route 90. The office's windows glowed behind me, though inside there was no power, and in my hand I still held a tin cup, half full of mercury that pulsed like a living thing. I tried to rise, but the world tilted. My reflection shimmered in a roadside puddle. 2 eyes that weren't mine blinked back. The cup slipped through my fingers and shattered, scattering beads that rolled into the cracks. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs refused. And as the dawn's first light painted the mesas in blood, I heard the faintest drip, just one drop, but it was enough to know the assay office waited, patient, always thirsty for the souls of those who dared to drink its silver. The wind came down out of the high canyon walls like voices calling the lost. At Dead Man's Brink, every newcomer felt it first in their bones, as if the rock itself remembered those who vanished here and tried to tell the living to go back. The path to the edge was nothing more than loose shale and ancient juniper roots. But once you came within sight of that yawning slice of sky, the world changed. It felt too thin, too exposed, like the veil that separated the living from the dead had been torn open, and you were teetering on its ragged edge. Jacob Mills was only 24 when he arrived, carrying his camera and a restless hope that art might save him. He'd read stories of the cliff of campers who awoke to empty tents, of hikers who staggered downhill with nightmares instead of limbs, but he believed in reason, in the steady click of a shutter and the solidity of good. Light. The sun was low on the afternoon. He reached the rim, turning the red rock to blood. He set down his tripod and peered over the precipice. The canyon stretched away like an unrolled tapestry of crimson and umber, the Colorado River glinting below like a serpent of silver. The emptiness called to him. He clicked off frame after frame, following the dancing brambles of heat rising from the stones. But when he looked back at the screen, he saw more than canyon walls. Faces crowded the distance, faces pressed into the stone like ancient fossils, mouths open in silent screams. He spun, camera raised, but behind him stood only empty air, the juniper trees motionless. A trick of the light, he told himself. He checked his settings. Nothing. He reset. The spectral shapes vanished, and he exhaled in relief until he heard the first scream. God, it was distant and thin, carried on the wind like a child's whimper. He froze, heart thundering, and the canyon answered him in 1,000 echoes, folding and twisting his own panic until the scream sounded like a chorus. He pressed his back to the cliff, certain that something invisible was peering from below. Shadows pooled at the cracks in the rock, elongated like fingers, slithering toward him with silent deliberation. The scream rose again, closer this time, urgent and ragged, and Jacob ran. He fled without looking back, stumbling down the slope until his knees bled on the shale. The wind followed him, a keening lament that wrapped around his ankles and tugged at his legs as though to drag him back. When he finally reached his truck, hands trembling on the door handle, He dared to glance upward at the brink. A pale shape hovered at the edge, a body so thin it seemed half spirit, its eyes black hollows. It leaned forward, mouth opening in. That same silent shriek. Then it fell, dropping like broken glass into the canyon's maw. The echo of its landing rippled up to him, distorted and distant, and Jacob slammed the door, locking himself inside. He left hastily, tires spitting gravel down the desert road, but the scream chased him for miles. That night, in a cheap motel, on the edge of town, he could not sleep. He dreamed of faces pressed to glass, of cold hands brushing his cheek. When morning came, he found messages scrawled on the mirror in condensation. "Help him, please," over and over until the glass was smudged. He washed it away and drove north, back to civilization, but the urges never stopped. At every window, he imagined faces watching. In every crowd, he saw lips moving in silent voice. The canyon had reached inside him and carved its echo into his mind. Weeks later, when Jacob failed to return calls from friends, one of them drove out to Dead Man's Brink with a GPS tracker. She found his camera bag on the rim, lens cap off, memory card inside. The last 10 photos showed nothing but empty cliff and light. Then on the final frames, a pair of feet, so pale they glowed, balancing at the very edge. The shutter had caught the moment before the jump. Rescue teams scoured the walls but found no body, only bare rock and windswept dust. The memory card was gone. And still, at dusk, roadside hitchhikers swore they heard screams slipping through the canyon, as though the dead were still trying to climb back up. 15 years passed and the stories grew. A group of college students on a geology field trip camped by the brink. They awoke to 3 empty tents and footprints leading to the edge, then halting. No screams, only a faint humming, like the stray broadcast of a broken radio. They retreated at dawn, but the humming followed them, warping into half-formed voices pleading for release. They stopped talking. A year later, one of them was found, drowned in her bathtub, lips blue, eyes wide in sudden terror. The humming was still in her mind, she wrote in a note scribbled on the mirror. The canyon's secrets fed on fear. In winter, when the wind cut like a blade and the snow draped the cliffs in white, few dared venture near. But hunters came, photographers came, thrill seekers came, each with their own rationale. Some sought the raw beauty of the desert, others the thrill of mortal danger. All of them vanished. Rangers searched for tracks, for scraps of clothing, for any clue, but Dead Man's Brink left nothing behind. Only voices. On the night the family disappeared, the stars were vivid, blanketing the sky in icy brilliance. They had parked their SUV at the overlook and spilled out to take in the view. The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing to shapes in the distance. "They're whispering," she said. "Can you hear them?" The parents laughed nervously and said, "It was the wind." They took a selfie with their arms around the child, bright faces glowing against the dark. The last photo was posted online 2 days later by a friend who found the truck Pone in the truck poses frozen in hapless joy. After that, the family was gone. No body, no sign, only the photo and the endless echo of that child's whisper. Rangers closed the park for a week, but when they reopened, it was the same. Tourists climbed the rail and peered over. Some left offerings, stones painted red, crosses of sagebrush, but the brink took them anyway. Soon, the park authorities removed the barriers, saying they could not spare resources to enforce a no-go zone. They put up warning signs, small metal plaques with blunt words. Nitrogen monoxide climbing, danger. But the signs were stolen or bent, then vanished into the desert. The tourists kept coming. Late in the summer of 24, an old prospector returned. His name was Boone and he claimed to have struck daylight gold in the canyon decades before. He'd been back once already, searching for his stash, but he'd lost his mule and sworn never to return. Now he was back, trailing a mule loaded with pickaxes and rusted buckets. He walked to the brink at noon, the sun an unforgiving eye overhead. He squatted on the stones and spat, then drew a crude map in the dust, pointing to a shelf dozens of feet below. "There's a vein," he said, voice gravelly as the trail, "deep down. I'll bring up gold," he promised on his next trip. He did not survive that trip. His bones were found in the creek bed months later, water-warm and bleached by sun. His letters home were in his pack, one addressed to a daughter he'd never met. "If I don't come back," he wrote, "keep the gold." No gold was recovered. In the pack, rags of cloth and a single shoe remained. The mule tracks trailed down to a scree slope, then ended at the lip of the canyon. No sign of Boone's path out. I visited once on a crisp autumn morning, when the air smelled of dying grasses and juniper berries. I walked the rim until I found the leather strap of a shoe wedged between stones. I knelt and picked it up. The wind was silent then, unnaturally so, and I was certain the earth was holding its breath. I placed the shoe back where I found it and turned away. My flashlight beam caught something in the crack, a handprint, not in dust but in fresh, red soil, digging a little into the stone. A palm so small it could have belonged to a child. The echo started before I reached my truck, drifting across the canyon like a sigh. Somewhere someone was calling for help. And in the distance, the river shimmered, but it looked to me like a wound. I drove on, but the memory of that handprint clung to me, whispering that the brink never let go. That, its dead had only paused, waiting for the next curious soul to peer over the edge and disappear, swallowed by echoes that never die. The wind in Echo Vale doesn't hum. It whispers, as if each breeze carries half-spoken prayers, half-remembered names. It threads through the skeletons of mesquite and juniper, stirring the brittle leaves until they tinkle like glass. They say the valley was christened by a dying settler whose last words, "Hear me," resounded off the walls of rock until nothing remained but that single tortured syllable. Since then, anyone who dares climb the narrow trail and peer over the rim hears the chorus. Faint voices on the wind begging for help, calling your name, promising salvation if you'll only follow. I should have known not to go. I'd read the old journals, one by a prospector who swore he found silver ore in the crags, then vanished. Another by a lost hiker who begged rescuers via scribbled map, then turned up in the arroyo days later, his eyes wide and empty, crawling on all fours, muttering something about joining in. But there's a gravity to Echo Vale, a pull that drags at your mind, and in the dry heat of that June afternoon, I found myself strapping on my pack and walking toward the sun-bleached. Rocks dotted first, there was only quiet. My boots crunched on gravel. Robes of dust rose behind me. The sage smelled bitter under my tongue. The horizon shimmered, distant, implausible. I kept expecting voices, but the wind lay dormant, as if holding its breath. Then, when I reached a low ledge and paused to drink from my canteen, I heard it, a soft, breathy sound like someone sobbing far away. "Please," it said. My heart thudded, no breeze stirred, but the voice was clear. "Help me." I followed a narrow path that zigzagged down a rocky slope, every instinct screaming to flee. The voice guided me soft and urgent. My hands trembled. Every step felt like trespassing in someone else's dream. Shadows lengthened as the sun lowered, turning the canyon walls to copper. The sobbing voice became distinct whispers, a chorus of them, rising from the rocks. "Over here," one said. "Don't leave me," another pleaded. They blended and split like ripples in water. I reached a cleft where the canyon widened. into a bowl. The ground was littered with rusty tin cans and broken bottles. I squinted. Shapes half buried in the shale-twisted metal, shards of glass, bone-white fragments I couldn't place. I sat on a boulder, dizzy. The voices swirled. "We're cold. I'm thirsty. I can't find the way back." I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound seeped through my fingers. A choir of despair. My breath came harsh and shallow. "Show yourselves," I whispered. I wanted to believe there were living people trapped, some lost campers, miners, fugitives. I closed my eyes and let the voices pull me deeper, as if I were drowning in their sorrow. When I opened them again, the valley looked unchanged, silent under the fading light. Yet the voices grew louder, pressing in on me from all sides, closer. Then distance should allow. I rose to my feet, no longer sure who was guiding whom. The canyon floor tilted. My boots slipped, and I nearly fell, catching myself on a cactus. My palms burned. The voices laughed then softly, cruelly like toddlers tittering at a cruel game. "Don't be afraid," one said, and another hissed. "Afraid of what?" The whispering turned mocking. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, my canteen. Clattering to the stones, I ran. The trail I came down vanished into the darkening crimsons of rock. The whispers chased me, echoing, "Stay, stay with us." My lungs burned. The air tasted of dust and rust. When I found the slope straight again, I realized with a pulse of dread that I had gone deeper, not out. The rim loomed somewhere above, but I couldn't see it. I sprinted, zigzagging, heart clenched against the chase. Then, in the gloom, I saw a shape, a hunched form at the lip of a hollow, its head lolling forward. I skidded to a halt. The shape turned. It wore tattered clothing, sun-bleached and rotten. Its face was pale as moonstone, eyes wide, unseeing. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and for a heartbeat, everything went still. The wind rose, scattering. My hair against my face, carrying voices that screamed in a single bone-rattling chorus. I wanted to help, to tell it that I'd found whoever had called. I raised a hand. "Hello?" My voice cracked. The form lurched forward, stumbling off. Its perch, arms reaching. I took a step back. It emerged in full view, gaunt limbs, skin stretched over bone, hair matted and gray. It looked less like a person than a nightmare carved from pain. Without warning, it shrieked. The sound was rending, a blade slicing through my mind. I staggered, clutching my ears, but the echo of that cry lived on inside me. The wind whistled, and now the valley was alive with them. Dozens of forms filing out of hollows and crevices, their bodies stiff and jerky, their lips moving in silent lament. Their eyes followed me, imploring, accusing, shimmering in the twilight. Stumbled back until my spine hit a wall of stone. The voices rose to a deafening roar. "Do not leave. We need you." They lunged, phantoms crawling down the rocks toward me, skeletal hands reaching. I closed my eyes and screamed, throwing myself at the canyon wall, sliding down until I hit the ground. Pain exploded in my side where I landed on a sharp stone. When I dared open my eyes, they were gone. The wind had dropped once more, leaving only emptiness. The forms had melted back into shadow. The whispers retreated, scattered like dust. I lay panting, the stones beneath me warm from the dying sun. My canteen lay shattered, water pooling around my elbow. My chest seized with each breath. I dragged myself to my feet, every joint screaming. I recalled the narrow ledge where I first heard the voice. It had to be above. I crawled, finding my footing on loose scree, hands bloody from scrabbling at the rock. The rim yawned above, a thin sliver of sky. The voices flared one last time, softer, exhausted, begging, "Come back. Stay with us." Their sorrow pressed against my ears, but I climbed out when I cleared the lip. Night had fallen. The moon hovered low, pale, and distant. Below, Echo Vale lay silent, an empty bowl of stone. I staggered away, not daring look back until the canyon disappeared behind me. Then, in the dark, I let out a shuddering laugh, terror and relief tangled. In my throat, I didn't stop until I reached my truck, its engine a sudden roar of life. The headlights cut through the night, revealing dust clouds in my wake. I sped down the dirt road, the wind whipping through the open window, carrying nothing but the night air. At home, I turned off every light and locked every door, but when I lay in bed, the valley's echoes came back. On the hush of each passing car, on every breath of wind through the shutters, I heard them, quiet now, distant, waiting. And I knew that somewhere in that bowl of rocks, those lost voices waited for the next stranger who would listen and the next soul who would answer their call. They say Frostbite Hollow only shows itself when the sun sits like a blistering eye above the plains, when the devil's breath turns asphalt into a ribbon of molten glass. I discovered it by mistake, a wrong turn off State Route 16 that spat me onto a lonely two-lane strewn with mesquite and tumbleweeds. The air was so dry my lungs felt like cracked leather. I stopped at what looked like an ancient gas station, peeling paint on the pumps, windows clouded with grime. The old man behind the counter gave me a look like I was a corpse come begging for water, but he took my money and pointed a gnarled finger down a dirt road. "You'll find it," he said, voice as dusty as the desert floor, "but be quick. The sun don't take kindly to trespassers." I drove until the road ended at a hollow nestled between two red-brown ridges. Heat waves danced like specters off the parched earth, and yet there, like a wound in reality, frost clung to the shutters of a single weather-beaten farmhouse. Solid ice, jagged and glimmering, despite the 98 degrees sizzling the land. My truck's tires crunched as I pulled to the side. The front door hung crooked, and from inside came a hiss like steam escaping a shattered boiler. Stepping through the threshold, I felt the temperature drop so fast it stung my skin. My breath carved little clouds in the air. Plumes of frost drifted from rafters that had long since given up their paint. The kitchen was a frozen tableau, a table set for dinner, plates still bearing the shapes of food long turned to sludge, silverware coated in needle-fine ice crystals. Against one wall, a mother knelt beside her young daughter, both figures sealed in thin sheets of ice, hair drifting like seaweed, eyes wide open. Across the room, the father's boots lay empty on the floor as if he'd shed them in a hurry. Should have turned and run, but something kept me rooted there, a whisper tickling my spine. I edged forward, the floorboards groaning under my weight. In the living room, frost climbed the walls in curdled patterns, blackened by time and terror. A record player sat on a side table, vinyl half exposed behind a frozen pane, its arm poised as if to drop. I remember thinking that if someone wound the crank, it might start again, playing a song that no living person dared hear. I climbed the stairs, each tread swollen with ice, and reached the second floor. The hall stretched into darkness lit only by shafts of white light that pierced through cracks around closed doors. Behind the last door, the temperature plummeted further. I pressed my palm to the knob and felt it shatter like glass under my touch. Inside, a boy sat on the edge of a bed, legs dangling, feet bare. His skin was pale as chalk, pupils dilated. He stared at me without blinking. The windows were frosted over, but beyond them I glimpsed the Texas sun, bright as an unblinking eye. "Why? Are you here?" His voice was brittle, like bits of icicle breaking off. I opened my mouth, but the words froze. Then the shutters rattled, and I saw movement outside. The three other figures from downstairs, mother, father, little girl, stood on the porch, their heads tilted, staring at me through the frost. Their bodies looked as if they'd thawed in places, flesh gleaming red and raw beneath melting ice, patches of skin sagging. They moved in unison, slow as drowning men, lifting their arms in a silent greeting. Panic hit me like a blow. I stumbled back, one foot slicing through a frost-glazed rug. It tore, revealing floorboards stained dark. Beneath, I saw something slither, a shape half seen and slick. The boy on the bed smiled, mouth cracking in multiple places. Tiny rivulets of water dripped from his chin. I recognized the sound, ice melting. I ran down the stairs, heedless of splintered wood, heedless of the rasping hiss as frost turned to steam around my ankles. The porch door slammed in my face, sealing me outside. The family pressed against the glass, frost creeping inward, fingers splayed on the pane like a graduation of claws. I rammed my shoulder against the door until it splintered. I threw myself forward, scraping my hands raw on the jagged wood, and tumbled onto the porch. Outside, the sun beat down without mercy. The family didn't follow. They watched from the threshold, frozen half in, half out, as though rooted by some ancient curse. I scrambled into my truck, shaking so hard I could barely twist the key. The engine stuttered, coughing steam. In the rearview mirror, I saw the boy step off the porch and vanish into the yard. Leaving no footprints, I shot back onto the highway, mind rattling. The world looked normal again, cattle grazing, birds wheeling overhead, the horizon a sharp line between dust and sky. I glanced at my GPS. No road called Frostbite Hollow. No town at all. But my rear view showed a flicker of frost on the back of my windshield, crystalline shards melting into rivulets. I fled until the heat pressure cooked my thoughts. At the next town, I pulled into a diner for coffee, trying to find someone who remembered that ghostly road. Nobody did. The locals shook their heads as if I'd wandered in from another planet. The old man in the booth behind me tapped my shoulder. He looked at the spot where Frostbite Hollow should have been on my map. "You saw him, didn't you?" he whispered. "Took my girl and her ma about 30 years back. Frostbite Hollow. Ain't on any map 'cause it don't belong to time." He sipped his coffee. "They thaw back to life on the hottest day. Then they walk back into the world looking for new blood to freeze." He spat onto the floor. "You're lucky. You got away." I left the diner and drove until the road swallowed me. Nights I still wake in a sweat, hearing the hiss of melting ice. This morning, I looked out my bedroom window at the sun blazing above Karachi's skyline, and there, etched on the glass by some unseen hand, was a frost line creeping along the edge. Even in this heat, the frost returns. And every time I blink, I see it crystalline fingers tracing my name, beckoning me back to Frostbite Hollow, where the frozen dead thaw and walk again. The first time I came to Sulphur Springs, I was broken bones shattered by a car crash, skin seared by an iron grill I'd been thrown against, heart pulverized by the sudden death of my wife. The townspeople said the spa's water could mend. Shattered bodies, soothe burnt flesh, heal scars both seen and unseen. They called it the Sulphur Springs life source, and when I dipped my bruised foot into the milky green pool, pain receded like tide water, leaving only a trembling warmth behind. My muscles relaxed, my nerves hummed, even my nightmares softened. It felt like salvation. By the second week, I slept through nights without waking, my dreams empty of screams. I polished my reflection in the crooked mirror of the crumbling room, where I stayed, astonished at the unscarred flesh gaining ground around graft lines. The townsfolk smiled at me in the grocery store, farmers tipping hats as I passed. They said the water made all things new, and I believed them. But on the morning I found footprints in the sand outside the spa, tiny, childlike tracks that pressed. Soft and perfect across the muddy banks, I knew something darker walked here. The prints led to a place where the earth broke open, a circular sinkhole beneath a gnarled oak. No child dared those woods. No parent spoke of children. The tracks circled a hole before vanishing at its edge. When I knelt to peer into the darkness, I saw something churn in the water below. A pale, slick shape with shining eyes, distant but watching. I backed away, heart thudding, chalky soil crumbling under my weight. The thing stirred, horror refracted. Through sulfur clouds and the water exhaled a low, briny hiss. That afternoon, old Mrs. Mallory, she tended the baths, paused at the threshold of my cabin. Her skin was as yellow as the springs themselves, eyes cloudy. She offered me bread and stewed okra, hands gnarled like tree roots. "Drink all you need," she whispered, voice a rasp. "It'll ease your mind." But her smile carved grooves into her cheeks, as though her face were a cracked mask slipping away. Behind her, a child's laughter tinkled high, playful but empty. I turned, expecting little Dolly or her brother children long gone. The yard was still. The breeze hissed through rusted swing chains dot by the third week. The water had cured my flesh entirely, no graft, no burned scar, yet it fed something ravenous in my mind. Late at night, I woke clutching the side of the tub, cold sulphurous mist rising in spirals, and a voice in the steam saying my name. I thought I recognized its timbre from my darkest dreams, but it wasn't my voice. It was yours, it was mine. A chorus inside one hollow skull. I splashed water on my face, saw my reflection twist, jaw slack, pupils black as tar. I tried to leave, packed my bag, hitched a ride to the highway. The sign reads Sulphur Springs, population 2,000 something. I pulled out the first state on my driver's license, drove north, speedometer shaking. But no matter how many miles I racked on the odometer, the sulfur smell clung to my clothes. The itch of mending flesh at my knee persisted. At dusk, the road curled back toward the hills, and the springs reappeared at the bend, lit by lamps glowing green and yellow. I slammed the brakes, heart hammering, but the car coasted to a stop. Exactly at the iron gate. The latch opened on its own, and the water seemed to beckon. Hungry. Now I live in that cabin, the roof sagging, windows yellowed by steam. The bathhouse hums day and night, a low mechanical breath that shakes the walls. I wander the forest trails, searching for those tiny footprints, convinced they will guide me to the sinkhole again. I whisper their names, Dolly, Tommy, but no one answers except the rustle of leaves and the trickle of water. Sometimes I see pale figures drifting beneath the surface, woman with dark hair and eyes wide as moons, a man whose flesh shimmers like ember, a child whose bones are visible through skin. They swirl around me when I plunge into the pool, pressing their faces to the glass between life and decay. They mouth silent pleas, welcome, welcome home. Drink and join us. I know what they mean. I feel my mind unraveling like yarn pulled by an unseen hand. Every other thought my home in Fort Worth, the scribbled layouts of the biotech firm I once managed, the name of the woman whose laughter used to light my days fades like chalk in rain. All that remains is the draw of the spring, its promise of peace that preludes oblivion. One night, I sat at the pool's edge, moonlight weaving through steam. The hush was absolute, broken only by the soft splash of a body slipping beneath the water. I peered over and saw my face, pale and placid, beneath the ripples. My reflection smiled a slow, gentle curve that wasn't mine, and I understood that death here wasn't the end but release. Release into the healing waters, forever part of the sulphurous glow. I closed my eyes and tipped my head back, arms open. The water licked my fingers, tugged at my hair, welcomed me with a cold kiss. I felt the madness bloom behind my eyes, a luminous bruise of longing, as my Body slid beneath the surface. The world went silent. The springs closed over me, and all I knew was the gentle pulse of water healing me, at last undoing, unmaking, returning me to the one true cure amid those unforgiving Texas woods. He stood on the edge of the abandoned siding at Cinder Junction long after the sun dipped below the scrubland horizon. When the cicadas finally stilled and the dark settled like a suffocating blanket over the rusted rails, the station sign swung. In the breeze, its battered letters half peeled away by decades of wind and neglect, and in the distance he could make out the silhouette of the boxcars, still chained in a neat row that stretched away into the blackness. Everyone in town said the derailment had killed them all, every brakeman, every conductor, every passenger on that midnight freight that had veered off course and plowed through the embankment, like a great iron beast driven mad. And still they called this place Cinder Junction, as though its name were meant to mock the charred whistle of steam and the brittle bones cooling under the twisted steel. He shivered, despite the June heat sticking to his skin like wet silk, and leaned forward to listen. At first it was only the faint sound of the wind rattling the freight cars, but then came a creak, sharp as a dying scream echoing down a stone tunnel, and the unmistakable slam of a boxcar door closing, only there should have been no one there to shut it. He swallowed against the sudden dryness in his throat, felt the slick slide of fear up his spine as the blackness around him seemed to inhale, pulling the last threads of daylight into its hollow throat. He told himself it was just the wind air leaking through the broken seals of the cars, but he knew that was a lie, because the sound had come again, twice closer, until it was almost at his feet, that iron door latching shut with a hollow boom that felt like the last heartbeat of the world. He had driven out here because he couldn't sleep, haunted by dreams of shattered glass and screaming steel, by the image of a child's hand reaching out through a gash in the train's flank. He'd seen her face in his nightmares, pale, eyes like flickering lanterns, mouth gapingly frozen as if in mid-scream. And that face drifted before him now when the wind shifted, bringing with it the faint tang of blood and charred metal. He blinked, tried to clear the haze in his vision, and saw a flicker of movement, a shape at the far end of the train, just beyond the glow of his trembling flashlight, something that might have been a person but whose limbs hung at impossible angles, as though the gravity itself revolted at the outline. He raised the light, his hand shaking so badly the beam wavered, and aimed it at the figure. For a single heartbeat, the darkness peeled back, and he saw her, the little girl in a soot-stained dress, her hair matted with grime, her skin ashen and cracked like old porcelain. Her mouth moved, forming words he could not hear over the roar in his ears. Then she was gone, and the beam of light fell empty on the rails as if she had never existed. He swallowed again, the taste of rust and decay on his tongue, and took a step forward, compelled by some terrible need to know whether she was real. The boards beneath his boots creaked and groaned, rotted through at the edges, and every sound seemed to amplify: the distant trill of an owl, the sigh of the wind through the telegraph wires, the scrawl of steel on steel as the cars shifted by invisible hands. Another slam, closer still, and he felt it reverberate in his chest like a fist pounding on his ribs. The metal door banged against its frame, echoing down the length of the train until the sound curled back around him. Chorus of hollow hearts that throbbed in the night. He realized then that they weren't slamming shut. They were latching open, begging for someone to step inside. A cold dread settled in his gut as he took another step, stumbled, caught himself, then advanced toward the nearest car. The door was cracked ajar, a wedge of darkness yawning inside, like an unseeing eye. His flashlight flickered, and he thought he saw movement within a cluster of shapes, bundled in ragged clothes, heads bowed. A dozen figures pressed against the far wall, motionless and silent, their faces turned away. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and reached out, fingertips trembling as he brushed the heavy iron against his palm. The door lurched open with a protest of grinding gears, and a rush of frigid air burst forth, carrying a symphony of muffled sobs and whispers that scraped at his mind like fingernails on slate. He stole a breath, louder than he meant, and one of them turned his way. A man with a face cracked like old clay, eyes hollow but burning with a white-hot desperation. His lips moved, forming shapes, but no sound came, and blood trickled from a split forehead, pooling in the dust at his feet. Behind him, more faces rose. A woman clutching a doll with its head missing. A teenager with long hair matted in coal dust. An older man whose mouth hung open in an eternal gasp. He realized with a wave of revulsion that every one of them had perished in the wreck. They were the casualties, the lost souls, the ones who should have rested beneath the earth. Yet here they were, beckoning him with skeletal hands, their voices a whispering tide urging him inside. He wanted to step back, to run away, but the rails behind him seemed to writhe and twist, sealing off his path. The night air pressed in, heavy and suffocating, and the flickering light in his hand sputtered as if fighting for life. He heard the distant click of the signal tower, the ancient mechanism engaging, a high whistle piercing the night so pure and terrible he felt it shatter his bones. The train began to vibrate on its rusted wheels, inching forward of its own accord. The boxcar doors slammed again, one after another, as if the ghosts were welcoming new riders. His heart pounded, his lungs seized with panic, but a strange compulsion flared within him, an echo of the whispered voices, telling him that he belonged here, that they had called for him all this time, that someone had to join their ranks. He took another step, and then another, until the edge of the platform gave way beneath his feet, and he tumbled into the car, landing with a gasp on the cold, filthy floor. The door snapped shut behind him, echoing across the siding like the final stroke of a guillotine. He scrambled to his feet, pounding on the iron with bleeding palms, but the metal would not yield. The train picked up speed, sliding along the tracks with a groan that shook his teeth. Through the small window high on the door, he saw the platform recede, the station sign spinning into a blur of shifting letters. The girl in the sooty dress pressed her face against the opposite wall, eyes wide and unblinking, and for a moment he met her gaze. Her lips curled into a terrible smile, and the headlights of a phantom locomotive blazed ahead, illuminating nothing but the endless track and the cinders glowing in the night. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound swallowed by the roar of the engine, and the car lurched forward into the unknown. The whispers rose into a howl around him, the echo of 1,000 regrets. It promised that this journey would never end, that the doors would keep slamming long after his breath fled his body, begging for more passengers to fill the void. The highway spat you out just past sundown, a ribbon of peeling asphalt bleeding into scrub and dust. Gravesend Ranch sat squat on the plain like a gnarled tooth, split-rail fences sagging under the weight of secrets. I'd heard the stories. Tombstones scattered across the pastures, each marking a ranch hand who vanished into thin air. No headstones in a graveyard, these stood alone, isolated monuments proclaiming absence. Even under scorching daylight, the place felt wrong, but night amplified it into something alive. The wind shivered through the mesquite and carried distant whispers, half words that tasted of old blood. I parked my rusted F-150 next to the corrals and tried to steady my racing heart. My name is Jacker Hollis, yeah, like the outlaw, and I came here chasing ghosts. My cousin Daryl was the last to disappear, swallowed up by this ranch 3 years ago. I promised his sister I'd find him or die trying. The main house loomed hollow, its windows black gashes. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped over cracked boards into a foyer thick with the stink of mildew and something fouler. Old photographs, hung crooked on dusty walls, grinning families in wide-brim hats, their eyes bright with hope. In the corner, a faded bulletin pinned up payroll sheets that ended abruptly. Luis Ortega, August 12, 2019. Pete Hammer, October 3, 2020. Daryl Hollis, June 14, 2022. No body, no explanation, just a blank date and a name etched in red rust dot by midnight. The moon crouched low, and I lay in the spare room, every hair on my neck singing. The ranch creaked doors opening in the hall, the slow scuff of boots too big for any current worker. My flashlight sat on the dresser, useless. I whispered prayers I didn't believe. Then came a thud, low and dull, like something heavy being dropped, followed by muttering, half-remembered Texas drawl. "Come on, partner, don't leave me hanging." The words drifted down the hallway. Each syllable tasted of desperation. I chased the sound through the dark corridors, heart pounding so hard I thought the walls would buckle. At the back door, I kicked it open and spilled into the pasture. The soggy earth clung to my boots. Up ahead, under the shimmer of my beam, the tombstones gleamed chalk white in the moonlight. I counted 12 markers, names I recognized from the payroll sheet, and in that moment understood why no one dared mourn. There was no graveyard here. The pastures were the graveyard. I stepped closer and saw faint footprints in the churned mud leading between the stones. I followed, breathing shallow, every nerve alive. The air vibrated like a held breath. Then I saw him, Daryl, standing stiff beside his tombstone, staring past me into the vast ranch. He wore dusty coveralls and looked 10 years older. His eyes were hollow as a skull. "Derry," I whispered, thinking relief would wash over me. Instead, dread knotted in my gut. He turned slowly, and his mouth opened a little, as if tugged by unseen strings. No sound came, but his lips moved. "They want a rider." A gust of wind rattled the stones, and the whisper rose into a chorus. "Rider, rider." The ground trembled under my boots. I couldn't move, fear glued me in place. Daryl swayed forward, reaching for me with arms that looked too long, too thin. His touch would be ice burning my skin. I turned and ran, splashing. Through mud, past the tombstones that seemed to snatch at my legs with ghostly fingers. My flashlight bobbed, casting skeletal shadows that sprang to life and lunged. The wind carried snatches of laughter, low and cruel. I burst through the back door into the empty house, slamming it behind me. The latch caught with a hollow click. I scrambled down the hall and out the front door only to find the world outside changed. The F-150 was gone. In its place, muddy hoofprints led off into the dark. Panic clawed at me. I looked up at the windows of the house. One on the second floor had been shattered. The jagged glass glittered like teeth. A cold weight settled on my shoulder. I spun around, expecting hands, but there was nothing. Still, I felt watched. When dawn broke, I found the caretakers, 2 old men named Harlan and Pike, leaning on their rigor fence posts. Their faces were lined like dried riverbeds. I tried to explain, but words came out in a tremor. Harlan spat tobacco into the dust. "Thought you was here to buy cattle, boy?" My truck's gone, and my cousin." Pike cut me off, eyes flat. "Boy, ain't nobody leaves Gravesend once the tombstones go up." He spat. "Folks vanish, tombstones planted, and that's that." They walked away, their voices drifting like vultures. No help. As the sun crept above the horizon, I realized the house behind me stood abandoned, as if empty for years. The fence posts leaned inward, crowding me. My hope turned ugly in my throat. I ran back through the fields, trying to find my truck, but the pasture stretched on, a desert of tombstones. My shirt stuck to my back, and the hot sun pulsed against my skin. The only landmarks were gravestones. Desmond J., June 5, 2018. Mabel Turner, November 21, 2019. Luis Ortega, August 12, 2019. Dates blurred in the heat. I shouted Daryl's name until my throat burned. I stumbled, parched and bleeding from a gash on my shin. I thought I saw my truck's tailgate glinting by an outcrop of boulders, but when I reached it, there was nothing, only more earth, more stones, all identical. Panic tripped me, and I fell. The ground beneath me was soft, like loose sand. My flashlight flickered in my pocket. I dragged myself upright and struck a match, fumbling to light the beam dot in its glow. I saw it, a fresh tombstone knocked half into the ground. My name, Jacker Hollis, today's date chiseled crudely in white rock. Beneath my name, a blank space for the cause of death. I tried to tear my eyes away, but I couldn't. The sky darkened. Birds fell silent. A breeze picked up dust and whispered, "Rider, rider." My chest seized. I felt something brush my leg, cold as grave soil. I backed away until I hit another marker. I looked up, heartsick. There stood Daryl again, his face a mask of longing. Other figures emerged from the tombstones. Pete Hammer, shoulders bent. Luis Ortega, eyes wide like candle flames. Then the caretaker men stepped out, though they'd gone to the house. They walked slow, arms extended, voices humming in low harmony. Stumbled backward, screaming. The ground shivered. Each stone rattled in place, as if eager to spit out its occupant. The figures closed in, silent except for that echoing chant. The words skittered through my mind and burrowed in, "Rider, rider." In one last burst of terror, I pivoted and ran blind, sprinting into the maw of endless pasture. The tombstones multiplied, crowding tighter. The figures glided behind me, swift as nightmare. My lungs burned. My legs buckled. I tripped and sprawled across damp earth. They hovered over me then. A circle of lost souls, faces twisted in hungry expectation. I tried to crawl, but hands gripped my boots cold, unyielding. I looked up into that ring of hollow eyes, and I felt my soul press against my ribs, begging for escape. The sky cracked open with a crack of thunder, though the air was still. Lightning split the darkness, and for one instant I saw dozens of tombstones ring me like silent judges. Then a bolt struck somewhere far off, and the figures recoiled. The ground heaved. I scrambled to my feet and ran until the first pale light of dawn stabbed the horizon. The chant faded into silence. The wind stilled and the stones settled. I burst through the fence line and into the highway, knees giving way, heart pounding like a war drum. I lay on the asphalt until sweat and tears soaked my shirt. When I dared turn back, Gravesend Ranch was gone, no fences, no tombstones, no house, just flat scrub stretching to the morning sun. My flashlight lay at the shoulder, its beam sputtering. In the grass. I scooped it up, hands shaking, and kept going, not looking back. But tonight, when the wind shifts and the mesquite rustles, I hear that old chant in my dreams. And in the corner of my eye, I see the glint of white stone. Because Gravesend never truly lets you go. It waits, hungering for its next rider. And I know in my bones I'll never outrun that whispering darkness. The first time I saw it, I was leaning against the chipped paint of my truck's tailgate, staring down that endless ribbon of highway that cuts through the scrub and mesquite flats outside Marfa. It was almost midnight, the moon a thin sickle in the sky, when a distant lantern light bobbed into view. At first, I thought it was another long-haul rig with a busted headlight, or maybe some half-crazed drifter waving a flare. But as it drew closer, the glow coalesced into the shape of a stagecoach, its silhouette impossibly crisp against the awning. dark, wheels grinding on the asphalt as if it were born to a dirt trail a century ago. The horses or the shapes where horses ought to be trod as silent as shadows. The coachman sat high on his perch, a top hat low over his face, whip poised but unmoving, and behind him the body of the coach swayed with the rhythm of a ghost's heartbeat. I was no stranger to weird in this part of Texas. Hell, this land breeds stories like scorpions breed stings. But something about that rig set my nerves on edge. It cast no shadow in the lamplight. The lanterns on its sides burned with a steady sulphurous green. I considered calling out, warning it not to come closer, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. As it rolled within earshot, I heard the creak of wood joints, the metallic rasp of iron rims, and just underneath it all, the soft wailing of a child. I blinked, and the coach stopped 50 feet from me, its lanterns flickering like dying eyes. The coachman's whip cracked once in the air, though nothing stirred, and he leaned forward, tilting his head as if to listen. That's when I saw the hitchhiker standing on the rear step, a man with hollow cheeks and eyes the color of wet asphalt. His clothes were dust-caked and torn in ragged strips. He reached out one hand, beckoning me closer without a word. The child's wail grew louder, a pitiful, ragged cry that clawed at my heart. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I stepped forward. My boots kicked up dust into the lantern light. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice a rasp that tasted like grit. The hitchhiker's lips curled into a thin smile. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead I heard that child's voice, crying out, "Help me, help me." It wasn't coming from him. It was coming from the stagecoach itself, from its battered wood, from the cold metal lanterns. I looked up, and for a heartbeat I saw dozens of gaunt faces pressed against the windows. Miners from the old Silverfall shafts, women from towns that no longer appear on any map, a preacher's children who vanished one Easter Sunday. They pressed, their palms flat, mouths open in silent screams, and I felt their desperation wash over me. I stepped back, hard hammering, and the coachman raised his whip again. This time the crack sounded like a thunderclap, and the ground trembled. The coach lurched forward, and the horses, if they were horses, gave a ragged exhalation, as though their lungs had been folded into scraps of shadow. A cold wind swept the prairie grass in waves, and a dozen jackrabbits bounded out of the mesquite, their eyes reflecting the lantern's green glimmer like twin beacons. Then the hitchhiker was gone, and the coach began to pull away. Before it vanished entirely, he turned to me, mouth stretched impossibly wide, and I knew without thinking that he was warning me. Run. Do not look back. But I was frozen, a moth trapped in a spider's sliver of moonlight. When I finally blinked, the stagecoach had faded into the heat haze of the desert night, leaving only the echo of that anguished cry. My knees shook, and I gripped the tailgate until my fingers whitened. I should have left. I should have driven straight into Marfa, called Sheriff Daniels, told him I'd seen something no sane man could believe. But when I tried the ignition, the truck wouldn't turn over. The radio crackled once, a single word emerging, midnight, then static swallowed everything. I spent the next hour pounding the steering wheel, watching the highway, straining for another glimpse of that spectral coach. But when the clock in the dash spun from 12 o'clock to 12:01, the night settled back into itself. No more green lanterns, no ragged voices. Just the tumbleweed rattling against the bumper and the wings of distant night birds dotted dawn. I stumbled into town looking like I'd fought a pack of coyotes and lost. Sheriff Daniels eyed me over his desk, then asked me what the hell I thought I was doing out in the flats at 2 in the morning. "I thought I saw something," I said. My throat was raw, and the words tasted like ash. He slid a cup of coffee across the desk black, just like he liked it, and I stared down into the dark liquid, thinking about how the hitchhiker's eyes had looked so empty. "You had a run-in with tourists, then?" Daniel said, shrugging. "No harm in that." He tapped the empty chair across from him. "Want to rest for a spell?" I shook my head, my mind still chasing ghosts. "It was real," I said. "I saw a coach. Stagecoach. Lanterns green as bile." He blinked, then glanced at the closed record book on the shelf. "Funny," he said. "There used to be a stage line run by a man named Ballard out there back in the 1880s. They say he ran nightly trips between here and Alpine, right through that stretch of highway. Something about a cholera outbreak near Paisano Pass. 6 passengers died in that coach, including a woman giving birth." He leaned back. "By sunrise, the coachman and the horses turned up dead, trampled in the mud near an arroyo. The bodies were never claimed. Some say Ballard went crazy and hired cheaper help." He shrugged. "Folks started saying the coach still runs at midnight, looking for fresh souls." I drained the coffee. After a moment, Daniels winked at me. "Come by the station today. We're holding a reunion for the old-timers. Some of them might remember more about Ballard's line." I nodded, but inside I felt that cold knot. I know what I saw. Something cruel. Something that drags good people off before sunrise and leaves their bones to bleach under the West Texas sun. That night, I went back. I parked on the shoulder, engine idle, and watched the black sky. The air was too still, as if the world held its breath in fear. At 20 to midnight, the desert wind shifted, carrying distant thunder that never cracked. At 5 minutes to, the lanterns appeared. 1, 2, 3 pale lights bobbing across the prairie grass. The coach came into view, and this time I was ready. I stepped into the road, heart pounding like a war drum. The coach slowed before me, then stopped. The coachman leaned forward, and at last I saw his face pale as chalk. His eyes were pits of emptiness. The hitchhiker stood on the rear step, hand outstretched. I wanted to run, but my legs refused. I moved closer, drawn to that hand. He grinned, showing teeth like splintered bone. Behind him, the faces in the coach windows pressed harder, mouths open in silent scream. I reached out, my skin went ice cold. My stomach lurched. Then the coachman cracked his whip, a sound that split my mind in two. I tumbled back, head ringing, and the coach lurched forward. The lanterns flared in my vision, green fires that seared through my eyelids. When I woke, the sun was gilding the horizon. My head rested on the dry gravel, and my truck sat 30 yards down the road, engine running. I stumbled to my feet, shaking, every inch of me humming with fear. My clothes were covered in dust and something darker stains that hadn't been there yesterday. Drove into Marfa without stopping, tires humming. At the station, Daniels looked at me with tired concern. "You all right, son?" I swallowed. "I think they want me to remember," he nodded gravely. "The station's record says the coach comes for those who know its story and invites them on board. Once you step up, you don't step down." I glanced at my hands, fingertips bloodless. Behind me, the station clock ticked toward midnight. I realized I couldn't leave this alone. I had become part of its tale. And until sunrise, there would be no escape. I'm writing this in the station log in case anyone finds it. If you hear the coach's lanterns on a desert highway, know that it's real. Turn your back and run. Don't look. And if you ever see a man with hollow eyes beckoning you aboard, just keep driving. Don't stop. Don't reach out. Because once the sun sets, that ghostly stagecoach will be waiting, and at sunrise, you'll never reach either town again. I first heard about the hollow oak when I was 7, standing beside my grandfather on the cracked pavement of Clear Creek's town square. The sun was sinking behind the low-slung houses, and the oak's crooked branches stretched across the sky like arthritic fingers. Grandfather whispered that people said its hollow trunk was full not of nests or nests of rats, but of bones. Settlers who once worshipped that tree and paid for devotion with their lives. I didn't understand then, but I felt something tug at my spine, a cold warning that followed me home. Years later, when I returned as an outsider from Austin, Clear Creek had not changed much. The same tired storefronts, the same old men who lingered on stoops, and the oak still stood at the square's heart, gnarled and stagnant. I found the townspeople polite but distant, and when I asked about the oak, they averted their eyes. Even under the high noon sun, its shadow seemed too dark. That night I dreamed of rattling bones and whispered prayers in an ancient tongue. I woke in a cold sweat. I had come to Clear Creek to write the town's history, to find the root of its strange lullaby of absence. By day I wandered dusty archives in the courthouse basement, turning brittle pages, discovering record after record of missing homesteaders, silent census entries, cartographers' notes of vanished settlements. Every map pointed to the square, as if the town itself had grown around that tree's curse. Town council minutes spoke of protests when someone suggested cutting it down. Fireflies had left en masse. Crops had withered on nearby farms, and the well water turned black for weeks after each attempt. The oak seemed alive, watching. On my fourth night, I heard someone tapping at my window. I lived above May's Diner, on the square. The tapping was slow, deliberate, like a branch scraping wood. I crept to the curtain and parted it. Moonlight glinted on white bone. A pale hand pressed against the glass, fingers' ends chipped and splintered like old twigs. Hard hammering, I flung open the window. No one stood there, but I heard laughter soft, reverberating as if 100 children giggling in a well. I slammed the window shut and tried to convince myself it had been a dream, or a trick of the branches. The next morning I found the diner's coffee pot shattered, cups strewn like grave markers. May said she'd seen shadows in the square at dawn, thin, wiry figures slipping behind the oak. She wouldn't elaborate, only muttered about the settlers and their blood oath and advised me to leave. But I was drawn in deeper. That evening I walked to the square under a sky bruised purple. The wind carried a chill I could not explain, as though winter had breached the season. I set my recorder before the tree, whispering questions into its hollow. Who are you? What do you want? A weakness I could taste in the air answered. M.E., a low hum like chanting. My recorder crackled, then went silent. I stepped closer, muscles taut. I heard breathing slow, measured, and felt breath against my cheek, though no one was there. I pressed my ear to the hollow trunk. Inside, beyond my vision, the bones lay stacked in choking layers, each femur and skull fitting like puzzle pieces left by a mad child. I felt dizzy, sick, and backed away. Something crouched inside and exhaled. I heard a voice, distant but alive. Stay. I ran. Sleep came in jittery stabs. Vivid dreams tormented me. Townsfolk dancing around the oak, faces gaunt, eyes black as drain holes. Children kneeling in a spiral of dirt, chanting in voices that cracked like dry wood. A flash of steel, a warm thud on earth blood blossoming at the base of the tree. I woke to the scent of rot. On the seventh night, thunder rolled though the sky was clear. The oak groaned as if stretching after centuries of sleep. I braced myself against the recorder, pressed record, and spoke. This is Emily Hartwell. I want the truth. The wind quickened into a howl. The oak's branches raked the flagstones. Then a single voice, high and trembling, whispered, "We belong here." I stepped back. The ground shifted. Fine dust rose like mist. I watched as pale hands reached up through cracks in the stone. Thin arms, gaunt and desperate, clawed toward the hollow. My breath caught. In that moment, the settlers emerged men. and women in tattered coats, their eyes glowing with fervor. They stood in a circle, facing inward, heads bowed. Their bones hovered an inch above the ground, held in place by something ancient. Unseen, they began to worship the oak, heads bowing and rising in slow, ritual cadence. The bones in the trunk rattled like dry leaves. Something spoke in a voice made of whispers. Blood for roots, flesh for bark. A gust of wind flung my recorder into the hollow. I froze as the settlers' heads whipped around. They turned pale, hollowed eyes toward me, as if seeing me for the first time. Then they smiled. I bolted, but the plaza seemed to stretch, the oak's shadow elongating into a cloak that swallowed light. My legs screamed, but I tore past the diner, past the empty benches, until I reached my room. I slammed the door, locked it, and pressed myself against it, listening as the chanting grew fainter, then ceased. When I dared to look out, the oak was still, its silence so profound I heard my own heartbeat. I never retrieved the recorder. I left Clear Creek by dawn, taking only my notes and a photograph I'd snapped of the hollow at dusk. Later, back in Austin, I listened to that tape. At first, only static. Then, faint beneath the hiss, the settlers chant like distant rain. Blood for roots, flesh for bark. And finally, my own voice, drowned by another whisper, stay. I never published my history of Clear Creek, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream of that oak, of splintered branches tearing at my windowsill, of hollow eyes pressing against glass. I hear the laughter of children in my walls, and I wonder, in the darkness, whether the settlers' bones will remain buried in that cursed trunk, or if one day they will slip free, step into the square, and begin their worship anew, inviting me back to the hollow oak, where each of us is welcome and none may truly leave. Jake Walker had always been drawn to places that whispered secrets, and Devil's Backbone was the finest whisper of all. The ridge arced through the scrubland like a crooked vertebral column, each jutting rock a vertebra that caught the dying light and held it in a bitter grip. Locals warned him off-tailies of a hidden trail that led to a place where the earth itself exhaled death, but he pressed on, convinced that the truth of the world lay somewhere beyond the edges of comfort. He parked his beaten-up sedan on a dirt road where the asphalt spat him out, grabbed his pack, and set off into the scrub. The sun was a dull ember on the horizon when he reached the base of the spine, and already the wind had turned cold, scything through his shirt like a blade. He found the narrow path easily enough, a faint scar across the ridge worn by years of feet careless or desperate enough to test the legend. At first, the climb felt routine, sweat on his brow, his lungs working against the thin air, but as he neared the crest, the trail began to shift beneath his boots. Stones rolled with a faint crack beneath his weight, and for a heartbeat he imagined he heard a low snapping somewhere deep under the earth. He paused, hand on his knee, listening. The wind carried a faint murmur, as though distant voices struggled to form words in its breath. He shook his head and kept climbing, eyes fixed on the highest point where the ridge looked poised to pierce the heavens. Halfway up, the scrub gave way to jagged limestone slabs, the path narrowing to a ridge so thin that on either side he could see the world dropping away into shadows of scrub and riverbeds. The sky above was bruised purple, the first stars timid pinpricks in the vast gloom. He slipped once, foot sliding, and caught himself mere inches from a sheer drop. His heart thundered in his ears, and the snapping sound came again, sharp and cruel, like a bone breaking. He froze, breath thick in his throat, and listened as the wind carried a hollow sigh from somewhere below. A sigh that carried the weight of centuries. He pressed on, each step a choice between panic and curiosity, until at last he emerged onto the spine itself. The world stretched out on either side in a yawning maw of darkness, the hint of a trail visible only as a thin ribbon of dust. He crouched and felt the rock under his palm, cold, unforgiving, etched with tiny hairline cracks that ran like veins. He rubbed at one of them and felt a faint vibration like the hum of a buried machine. Then the ridge trembled, a subtle pulse under his hand, and he staggered back as the whole thing groaned out against every instinct. He stood and began walking the crest. With each footfall he felt something shift beneath him, a faint click, as if the stones were realigning to accommodate the shape of his foot. The snapping sound followed him, not loud enough to be certain, but loud enough to drip dread into his blood. He could swear that with each step he felt a tiny give in the ridge, as though the bones of something colossal lay buried just beneath the surface and flexed in malevolent greeting. Midway, he stopped and looked down, a shallow cleft in the rock, just wide enough to slip a fingertip into. Curiosity won. He slid his finger in and scratched at the dust. The ridge shuddered violently. A hollow chuckle rolled across the plateau and vanished into nothing. He yanked his hand free and stumbled backward, ears ringing as though a boulder had fallen behind him, though sight revealed nothing. In the sudden hush he heard his own blood pounding. The stars overhead seemed suddenly sharp, too numerous, and the night air tasted metallic. He should have turned back then, his spine screaming, but the promise of revelation was too intoxicating. He climbed back onto the spine and resumed his measured pace. The trail curved and moonlight slid through. The scrub like skeletal fingers, illuminating shapes that might have been headstones. He paused, breath rasping, heart a drum. The snapping sounded again, this time unmistakable, a crisp fracture that echoed in his chest. Beneath him the ridge jolted, an appendage jerked upward, and he lurched as if the earth were testing his balance. He realized then what the locals meant. The ridge was alive. A spine, not of stone but of some ancient, buried organism, still twitching with rancid vitality. And he was walking its back. Fear sharpened his mind. He drew his jacket tighter and whispered curses under his breath. The wind howled in response, a mocking howl that carried a faint melody of voices. He felt watched too, eyes glittering in. The darkness, embedded in the rocks like shards of glass catching the moonlight. He forced himself to take another step. The snapping grew louder, faster, rhythmic, like the cracking of vertebrae. His boots landed on a section that gave a little too easily, and he stumbled, hand scrabbling for purchase on a rock. His palm grazed something smooth and bony. He recoiled, but the ridge didn't let go. Panic clawed at him. He spun and began retracing his steps, but the path had shifted. The ridge behind him stretched out unnaturally, as though the rocks had rearranged themselves in the moments he wasn't looking. The silhouette of the spine glowed faintly under the moon, vertebrae jutting like ribs of some behemoth. The snapping followed him, urgent now, insistent. He fled, boots pounding, heart hammering so loudly he thought it would burst from his chest. The world tilted beneath his feet as the ridge bucked and groaned, as if trying to throw him off its back. He reached the edge where the ridge met the dirt road, lungs burning. A final snap echoed beneath him like a gunshot. He leapt down and rolled, sliding across the gravel into the brush. When he scrambled to his feet, the ridge had stilled and looked as inert and innocuous as any other rocky promontory. He backed away until the bones of the ridge no longer pressed against his senses, until the wind was just the wind again. Then he turned and ran into the darkness, leaving Devil's Backbone behind. He reached his car under a sky that had returned to normal, the stars placid and distant. With trembling fingers he fumbled the keys, started the engine, and drove without, looking back. The road was empty, the world silent, but he felt the ridge's heartbeat in his chest, a distant echo that would not fade. At home, sleep came only as a fever dream of cracking bones and whispered names. He awoke with his mattress damp and his heart still racing. He told himself it was over, that he would never return. But sometimes, in the dead hours before dawn, he hears it again. A faint click, a soft fracture, and a whisper that drifts on. The wind, promising the devil's backbone, still waits, alive and hungry, eager for another spine to snap beneath its back. It was just past sunset on a late October evening when I first heard the stories of Devil's Hollow, a name locals spat like a curse. A place where the oak trees curved together overhead, twisting their limbs into something like claws, and where the earth itself exhaled a damp, sour breath. They said that every generation, for reasons no one could explain, the old preacher who led the tiny congregation at St. Amos's Chapel went mad. They said he would stand at the pulpit under that single dusty window, clutching his lantern. So tightly the glass would weep cracks, and then he'd begin to see things in the shadows, shapes shifting where there should be none. At first it was harmless. Folks thought just an overactive imagination, maybe a touch of walnut moonshine. But one Sunday, when the lantern's glow began to dance across every face in the pews, he lost his mind. He pulled a knife so long the blade caught the last embers of daylight streaming through the stained glass and turned it on his flock, slicing and cutting until the chapel floor became slick with blood and prayers choked in 24 throats. I didn't believe it, of course. I drove out from Dallas with skepticism still warm in my chest, intent on proving that Devil's Hollow was nothing more than a backwoods fable told to scare children into behaving. The road was a crooked scar through scrubland and shale, and my headlights picked out the decaying sign, its letters carved crudely. Welcome to Devil's Hollow, and then the macabre silhouette of St. Amos's Chapel, half swallowed by vines, its roof sagging like a broken promise. That night, the air tasted of rot, and the wind groaned through the window frames, as though it were mourning the dead. I parked beneath a dying cedar and walked up to the door, flashlight in hand. The pews lay overturned, and the altar was flecked with dried rust. I could almost feel the weight of history in that empty space. Every prayer unanswered, every hymn cut short. But what struck me most was the dusty lantern on the pulpit, identical, I imagined, to the one the preacher held that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still warm, as if someone had only just set it down. The locals called it a haunting, but I thought it was all too human, the superstitious riffraff filling the air with their godless gossip. Still, I stayed. I camped in the rusted-out shell of an old school bus on the edge of the hollow, spending my days poking through county records and my nights staring at the chapel, waiting for the lantern's flame to ignite itself. I laughed when the wind rattled the windows, muttering about how gullible these people were. And for a while there was nothing, just the whisper of insects, the distant howl of coyotes, the earth settling into silence. Then the lantern appeared. I was awakened just before midnight, startled by a faint glow spilling through the rotted boards of the chapel window. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks, but the light pulsed with a rhythm, like a heartbeat born inside those cracked panes. I slipped on boots and crept toward the chapel, each scrape of stone beneath my feet echoing like a warning. When I reached the door, I pressed my palm to the wood. It was icy, and yet the glow beyond seemed to hum against my bones. I pushed it open, and the lantern floated there above the pulpit, its flame flickering a sickly yellow, illuminating every droplet of dust hanging in the air as though solid. I raised my voice half to laugh, half to threaten, and called the lantern out by name. The flame flared brighter, and I heard it then, a whisper skirting the edge of my hearing, a child's voice singing a warped hymn, words I couldn't place but that crawled beneath my skin. My flashlight beam danced across the pews, and I saw them, outlines of people, faint as smoke, seated where their bodies had fallen years ago, their heads bowed, their hands clasped in prayer. The preacher's figure stood at the pulpit, tall and gaunt, his face hidden in shadow. In his hand he held the lantern, and in the other a knife slick with fresh blood. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the chapel door slammed itself shut. I crashed into the school bus, nearly knocking myself out. The lantern's glow seeped through the cracks of the walls, and I watched in terrified fascination as it rose into the night sky, floating above the trees like a baleful star. It hovered, then dipped toward me before retreating back into the chapel. I scrambled to the bus's front seat and locked the doors, my breath ragged. I didn't sleep again. At dawn, when the first pale light cracked the horizon, I found the chapel door wide open. Inside, the lantern sat on the pulpit exactly where I'd seen it, cold and inert, its flame snuffed out. I dared to squat beside it and touched its metal rim, and there, scrawled in something dark and sticky on the wood beneath, were words that made my blood run cold. Welcome home. I fled then, motoring through dust and dawn until Devil's Hollow was a distant memory in my rearview mirror. But I couldn't outrun the image of that lantern, nor the preacher's empty eyes. Back in Dallas, I tried to return to normal life. I drank coffee in the morning, sat through meetings, answered emails. The glow haunted the edges of my vision. Lamps in my apartment flickered even when bulbs were brand new. Shadows lengthened and warped in corners where there were no corners. I felt watched, as though something had slipped into my soul when I touched that lantern. The visions began a week later. I'd be working on a report, staring at my screen, when suddenly the preacher would be there behind me in the glass of my monitor, knives in hand, flame dancing in his sunken cheeks. I'd spin around only to find empty space and a cold draft whispering through the room. My phone would ring, and when I answered, static and that warped hymn would pour through the line, low and beckoning. Sleep became a battleground. I dreamt of twisted pews and the preacher's grin as he slit my throat and held the lantern aloft, its glow pulsing in time with my fading heartbeat. I tried to leave the country. I booked flights to Europe, to Asia, anywhere but Texas, but every ticket I purchased vanished from my email, replaced by the words Devil's Hollow scrawled across a blank screen. My bank account emptied itself in tiny, impossible withdrawals payments to places I'd never visited, all listed under a vendor named St. Amos. I couldn't eat. I could barely move. Every reflection I caught in glass or chrome showed that lantern burning behind my eyes. In my final act of desperation, I returned to the chapel, not as a skeptic this time, but as a penitent. I walked up that crooked path with my hands raised, tears drying on my cheeks, and laid the lantern on the altar. The moment I did, the church door slammed shut behind me and the pews groaned. The preacher emerged from shadow, and his voice was a rasping chorus of every soul he'd ever claimed. "It's time," they hissed. And through the cracked glass, that same sickly flame cast their faces onto the walls, dozens of them, lips curled in grim smiles, eyes burning with the promise of endless worship. I knelt and whispered apologies, but they wouldn't hear me. The preacher lifted the lantern higher, and I understood that Devil's Hollow was not just a place but a promise, that the dead would never rest until they had company in the darkness. I shut my eyes as he brought the knife down, and I felt the wet kiss of steel across my throat, the world slipping into nothingness. When the lantern's glow finally died, the preacher smiled at the empty pews. Locals would come searching in a few days, muttering about how they hadn't seen me leave. They'd call the sheriff, who would find no body, no blood, only the lantern sitting neatly on the pulpit, its glass fractured, the wick smoldering. And the wind in the hollow would carry the faintest echo of a hymn as new names were whispered into its darkness, inviting them home.